And in the beginning of everything, in A up the mountain, many people are searching for some, and our friend says he's been suffering on Mount Tianmen Xinjiang for 2 weeks, but he finally got his hands on, and it's full of strange letters. But for sure, it's the real, legendary secret technique, said to have been left behind by the sword sage approximately 600 years ago. The sword sage's secret record, and he desperately wants to keep it for himself, but it will be useless to him because his dantian is broken, and the other martial artists will try to steal it from him if they find out he found it. So he starts stashing it away, thinking he needs to hide it before someone arrives, throwing it inside and swallowing the thing, and he thinks he should have brought some water. My friend, there's no amount of water in the world that could help you swallow that, you know? You swallowed almost half a meter of bamboo. And then, the men arrive, realizing where he was, saying that he's the spy for the bloody cult, asking if he found the secret records of the sword sage, and that he's the leader of the White Gold clan, and a member of the Moyanso Martial Alliance. And the protagonist tells him that he did find them, and kept them in a safe place, saying that he will hand them over, keeps his promise. At that point, Peikgu and Hyang inquire about the promise, mentioning they heard about it on their way there, and ask if he wants them to remove the bloodworm from his chest. Hyang simply states that this was indeed the promise, but they no longer need to keep it, drawing his sword and saying that even if they remove the blood, he will have nowhere to return to, as he knows very well that the protagonist is Xiao Hui from the Radiant Earth clan, and he was exiled from the clan after his Dante was destroyed due to the key frenzy he suffered. 10 years ago, he was kidnapped by the bloody cult, and they implanted the bloodworm in his chest. And since then, he has been forced to be a puppet of the bloody cult. So, even if he gains his freedom, Yun Seo asks where he's going. Then the boy finds himself completely cornered, realizing that he knew everything about it, and asks what Yun Seo is trying to say. And he orders the sage of the sword's secret records to be handed over immediately, because if he does so, he will take it into consideration when thinking about removing the worm from it. But while Yun Seo places the sword against the protagonist's neck, he says that the records were hidden in a place known only to him, saying that he knows his situation and is not asking for any special privilege, such as being accepted the orthodox fact. And at that, Yun Seo simply observes the boy, saying that he only wants to escape the bloody cult and live a minimally decent. So, he first asks Yun Seo to remove the blood, and as soon as they do that, he will gladly hand over the secret record. But the old man behind him laughs at him, saying that he's actually quite clever. But Yun Seo keeps the sword in the protagonist's chest, saying that the way a low-level spy hides something is obvious, and bets that he's hiding it in his body. And the protagonist realizes that they intended to kill him from the beginning, and he falls back after taking that stab. And so, Yun Seo tells him not to hate them so much, because at the moment he became a spy, he was destined to die that way. And the protagonist is completely lost, wondering how he ended up living such a shitty life. And Yun Seo hits him again, cutting the protagonist and knocking out that scroll. And Yun Seo is surprised, because the secret records were inside. But then, something begins to envelop the protagonist, blue flame, and they question what has happened. And the protagonist, in the middle of that blue flame, realizes that it is not hot, wondering if it is real fire. But he wonders what that matters now, because if there is such a thing as a second life, he hopes it won't be as miserable as this one. But as he feels his life slipping away, someone throws water in his face, and the protagonist gets up, feeling that he is cold. And 2 kids are there, making fun of him. And the protagonist realizes that his body is whole, without any cuts or burn. And then, those 2 idiots call Xiao and Hui, saying that he's a pathetic mule. And the protagonist recognizes the voices of the 2, for they are the infamous ghost white twin and black twin, Sunjo Baek and Oh. But the protagonist wonders why they seem so young. However, when he looks to the side, he gets a fright, and he notices that he looks even younger. Then, one of the twins goes up to him and kicks him, asking if he's still telling him to get out of here and pay them already. However, the protagonist is on the ground, pain, and he ends up realizing that if it hurts, it can't be a dream. He gets up and asks them what day it is. He keeps asking, and one of them says it's August 9th, the 11th year of the century. And the protagonist is surprised that it's still this year, because if it's August 9th of the 11th, then it's exactly 10 years before his death. And then someone else asks what year he thought it. What kind of idiotic journalist did he become from drinking too much? However, the protagonist begins to smile, grabbing the twins in blue, saying that it's very good to see Jobot, and it's very good to see, and he tells him to let go because he's freezing. And then, the protagonist thinks that if that's the case, they're now being invaded. And the bloody cult really does arrive, cutting off the first one's head. And when the other sees it, that sect begins to be decimated. While the protagonist is very nervous trying to find some, Jobot asks if he's out of money. The protagonist says that if he doesn't want to die, they should leave now. However, the boy says that the protagonist has been very agitated since early this morning, asking if he needs to teach him a lesson. However, the protagonist finally finds some. The only memento of his mother is the sword Soda, and he says he has been filled with regrets ever since he lost her in his past life, thinking that even though escaping is the priority, he needs to grab this fur. But then, he hears someone scream, and the protagonist wonders what it was, because he thinks he's gone deaf. However, outside, people are calling for help and shouting, and Jobok asks if his brother heard it, and the protagonist thinks it was too loud to be coming from outside. But he thinks now is not the time to debate about it, and the shouting means it has already begun. And the twins try to look outside to see who these guys are. However, the the protagonist asks them to get out of the way. And when he looks over there, he notices that the damned wretches from the bloody cult have arrived that way. And since it's August 9th of the 11th grade, that was the day he was kidnapped by the bloody cult. Then, Jobok asks if they are bandits, and the protagonist says no, saying they are blood cultists, and they don't have time, and saying that they'll get there soon, and if they want to survive, they must run. But Jobok is surprised, because he thought the cultists had disappeared long ago after losing to the Martial Alliance. But the protagonist asks why he doesn't go there himself and at that point, the two of them get scared, and the protagonist says that now is not the time to take care of them. And these guys became martial arts masters after being kidnapped, and everything will be fine as long as he survives. But now that he notices, when he stops to think, there was someone else, Song, and he thinks that he also came with, and he was the only ally he had in the Radiant Earth clan, and he thinks he can't leave his brother behind, and he goes to Song, telling the boy to get up, and the boy speaks to the protagonist, who got a huge fright. However, the protagonist tells him to get up, because they need to escape from there as soon as possible, and the boy asks what's happened, and the protagonist just drags him away, saying that they're being attacked by the bloody cult, and they'll be entering the inn soon, and the boy can hardly believe it, but the protagonist just tells him to shut up and only trust him. But the boy tries to drag him towards the exit. However, the protagonist says that they can't go that way because the whole city is surrounded, and they'll be caught as soon as they leave. The boy then asks if they can't go back to the room and hide in the wardrobe. However, the protagonist says it's a very obvious. They're not there for the money and want to capture people like himself. Meanwhile, a boy who was in the wardrobe is actually found, and he says they're going to search every corner where someone could hide it, like wardrobes, large vases, and anything else. They would have been found anyway. So, the girl asks if they're going to be captured, killed anyway. However, the protagonist continues leading the boy, saying they need to hide in a place where no one would expect, like a place where no one would hide, even if they thought about it. And he takes the boy to the bathroom and says that nobody would expect someone hiding, and he tells the boy to jump, but the boy keeps refusing, and he says he'll leave him with the only bath, so he should thank him later. But while the protagonist pushes him away, the boy even tries to stay. However, the protagonist manages to throw the boy there, and thinks that even the bloody cult wouldn't look for him. He was going to hide there, but he had no other choice. He needed to find a place to hide before the cultists arrived, and he looked to the side, seeing a stable, realizing that death wasn't his destiny. After all, he hid there, taking the horse out, hiding under the hay. He notices that it's not a bad place to hide. They'll be looking for the horse that escaped, not the place where it eats. But if there's an advanced martial artist around, he'll find him by his sense of direction, and it's best he holds onto his gun just in case. But when he puts his hand on the gun, he sees the gun talk, telling that damn child not to hold it, those disgusting, and the protagonist questions what that noise is. Then, the weapon asks what it is, telling the boy to clean his hand, asking if he's ignoring it because it's a short sword, and the protagonist is surprised, wondering if the sword is possessed by a goat or something like that. But she denies this, saying, in a completely rude manner, he said that the sword only brings back memories of his mother, whom he took and stuffed in his bag. However, while the sword is making a sound, she realizes that he has just responded. It's a human who can hear a sword introducing itself in the shape of a tiny moon. Yes, a tiny big-headed moon. So, she thinks that if he can hear the voice of a sword, he should also be able to see her avatar. And the protagonist wonders what the hell this is, even questioning if he's hallucinating, because it can only be a prank. And he says he can't hear or see her, lying through his teeth. And she says she knows he can hear and see her, because normally swords read human thoughts when they are in contact. And the protagonist becomes increasingly surprised, but then he notices something, realizing that someone is going there, telling her to quiet. And she questions if it's because of that guy, saying she thinks that's the only way he hear her. And the protagonist says he understands, telling her to be quiet because he's unable to think straight. Meanwhile, the cultist continues observing things around him until he sees the protagonist's foot leading directly to the hay and approach. The girl says she has a question for him, asking if he will attack her if found, because without considering whether he has the strength or not, she asks if he has the courage to do it, as his heart is beating too fast and he's terrified. And so, when the cultist puts his hand in the hay, the protagonist remembers his past life was killed. And just as the cultist was about to find the protagonist, flies at him, hitting him right in the middle of his throat, making him fall hard. And the protagonist doesn't even believe her to assume he's scared, saying it's nothing like that. And he's excited, telling her to just pay attention, because he's going to survive this life, no matter what. And she thinks he's very good, saying she thought he was just an idiot who spent his days drinking with the song kid. But it seems she needs to reassess him, asking when he learned something. And the protagonist thinks she's getting on his nerve, telling her to be quiet, intending only to ignore him. And he thinks to himself that the situation has worsened, because the warriors of the bloody cult are known to move in groups of 3 during mission, and the companions of the guy killed will show up soon. Although he hid the body, it won't be long before they find him. And if he's caught in a situation like this, they won't even try to make him talk. They'll just kill him right away. And her priority is to end this and get out of it. However, she speaks with honor, and he questions what it is. did. And she says that she wishes she could do that, but there's a warrior from the bloody cult after. So she thought she should tell him. And the protagonist looks back, seeing that there really is someone, and he questions if he's interrupted, telling the boy to continue and not worry about it. He'd been watching the whole time, and he says he's interested in his work, asking if he's not going to continue. And the protagonist wonders how long he's been there. Or rather, he also looks at that belt, noticing that it's a brown belt. And he's a mid-rank warrior, thinking that he should have been faster, because if he's mid-rank, he has no chance of beating in his current state. And the girl asks if he's going to fight. However, the protagonist notices that he's been repeating the same thing since early on, wondering if it might be disruptive. And so, the warrior comes at him, saying that he doesn't seem to know any martial arts. And even in a surprise attack, it's impressive that he managed to assassinate a low-ranking warrior. Asking if he's somewhat skilled, he says he'll make him an offer. If he surrendered, he'll let the boy live. The protagonist considers provoking, saying that if he intended to kill him, he wouldn't be talking about his skills or anything else, thinking he came all the way there to capture. But he asks if he's afraid of ending up like the other guy tried, and the guy gets furious. And the girl asks if he's gone crazy, questioning what he'll gain by provoking. The protagonist thinks it will all go according to plan, and he's going to act like a super confident idiot to make him lower his guard. And so, the masked man thinks he has the audacity to laugh at the boy, saying that he is a cunning fox too, saying that killing him would be a waste of. And the protagonist realizes that he is more sensible than he thought, and he says that it seems that his intentions are to avoid a fight. So he's going to test the boy to see if he's as skilled as his brain is mouth. And the protagonist steps aside, losing some of his hair. And the protagonist thinks that even though he's weak, his dantian will destroy. And that much is still visible to his eye, attacking that warrior. But he calmly holds the protagonist's hand, saying that he was too slow. And at that, the protagonist gets a little nervous. And he says that his eyes may be good, but his hands are slow. And he raises the protagonist's hand all the way up, making him drop his dagger. And he says that even so, his counterattack was quite accurate, saying that he will ignore the fact that he killed one of those warriors, follows him quietly. So the sword, as it falls, lands in the protagonist's other hand, who catches it from behind and delivers a counter to the warrior, while saying he won't do it. Then, the warrior starts to get angry, because he only received a blow to his eye. And at that moment, the protagonist is surprised that he dodged a point-blank attack. And then he really, my friends, I know this guy, huh? I think he was stealing someone's idea. And he gets furious with the protagonist, giving the boy a huge kick right in the chest and throwing him far away. The protagonist goes off to retrieve his horse, wondering if he was too optimistic, because he thought that warrior wouldn't be able to dodge him so close. So when he gets up, he thinks he has no choice but to fight head-on. But then, Sodam speaks to Ahoy, saying she will help, stating that he has zero chance of winning without her. And the protagonist asks what she can do in such a situation. And she, realizing he's going to keep arguing, asks what she'll do. And he thinks he didn't manage to cut deep enough, but now it's harder for him to use his left eye. So he should focus on that side. And so, that cultist thinks he tried to be nice. But the kid is a complete son of a bitch, asking if he really wants to die that badly, saying that originally he was going to punish him a little and then send him to the cult. But he changed his mind. The boy is going to die then. He says he's going to cut him into pieces, lunging at the protagonist, while he notices he's using the basic sword technique of the blood cult, the bloody, murderous blade. And he thinks it's fast, because he can't even see a pattern. And he also realizes that the warrior is deliberately avoiding the attack. And he starts asking the protagonist if he's now realizing what he's done. And the protagonist realizes that he's going to have fun slicing until he's dead. And he's actually enjoying attacking the protagonist, saying that his life is already compromised. And the boy notices that he's using snares against him too, wondering what he should do, questioning whether he'd stab and hope for the best. But Sodam tells him about the frontal thrust, and the boy manages to stop that attack. The cultist can hardly believe, and the protagonist ends up being thrown far away. And he's surprised that he blocked the blow. And Sodam says that was very good, and he really did block, because if she hadn't helped him, he would have died now. And the protagonist asks her if she can see his attack. And she says she was going to help because of that, because a weakling being whipped by a worm like that is easy to watch. And so she starts mocking, saying that maybe he should have stayed quiet. And he apologizes for having ignored her twice for asking for her help. And she says yes, because after 47 years, she can't allow an exotic creature that can hear her to die like. And then she asks if he has a plan to follow after she reads his attacks and he says he's thinking about, but in his current state, it's complicated because he already hit him once, so he's not going to get within reach of his short swording, and that guy is trying his best his distance. And she says that, however, if he makes her impatient, an opportunity will open up. At that point, the cultist is surprised that he blocked her last attack, asking how the boy did. He wonders if she deciphered his technique, but he thinks that can't be true. It must have been pure luck, and there's no way a weakling like he could have done that. And he says he's definitely going to kill the girl, right? He tells her they'll first block the the attack and buy time. And the protagonist then simply asks her to tell him the direction of the sword. And while he continues attack, Sadama tells the protagonist that the next attack is coming to his left shoulder. He says it's a feint, telling him to go to the right. And the cultist can't hide his surprise, wondering how he's guessing. And then he sees that the blood is obscuring part of his vision, and his left eye is no longer usable. Sadama then tells the protagonist that if he stays in his blind spot, he will become impatient, and his random counterattacks will be imprecise, but quick. And he's definitely going to try a horizontal cut, telling him to wait a bit before advancing. And then, when he does as Sadama had said, the protagonist manages to get underneath, anticipating that strike. And then, he questions how this has happened, but in truth, it was all an act. The boy wondered if he'd expected to be caught off guard like that, landing a powerful kick on the protagonist. And he even puts his hand up to defend himself, but it ends up flying away. And the poor guy's right hand is already all battered blood. And the cultist even asks if that broke his arm, saying it was impressive of him to use his blind spot, but he's still just weak, and he lunges forward, trying to kill the boy. However, the protagonist grabs something from his clothing and quickly turns around before being hit. He manages to turn and land a counter, beheading the cult. He hits him without giving him a chance to defend himself, and after that, the protagonist realizes he cut him direct. Then, the two end up falling to the ground. Sadama asks if he can get up, and the protagonist says he's fine, and she says his acting was incredible, and for a moment, she believed her arm was broken. But the protagonist tells her that if he had been a little more alert, that wouldn't have worked. And she says that his last attack was also very cool, extending his legs and spinning while cutting her throat. And the boy says that all of this was only possible because of his help. Thank you. And she seems a little surprised. But the protagonist asks if she was frustrated, and she says he's nothing like that. And if he's so grateful, she asks why he doesn't clean the blood off his sword properly, and asks if she's angry. But she says no, telling him to dust it off and also do some maintenance, because the maintenance his mother used to do on the relic was terrible. However, she can't even finish speaking. She simply tells Enro to move his head, but the protagonist can't, and he's hit with an absurd punch that sends the boy flying, and he doesn't even have a chance to react. And when the protagonist falls to the ground, the man who knocks him down is surprised, because that situation is quite disconcerting, and he hurried over there after the other two didn't return, but they were killed by a mere child. And the protagonist, on the ground after being hit, is covered in blood. And after a while, the cultists take the protagonist's identity, realizing that he is from the Radiant Earth, and he is a well-known playboy in Renah Province and the heartthrob of Luoyang City, and he is treated as an outcast by his own family after having the Dantian shattered by a key frenzy. And since he's the son of an orthodox clan, they question whether they should take and raise him as a spy. Imagine that same guy who beat up the protagonist say no, saying there's no point in creating a disaster when there isn't even a Dantian, and he'll die unable to complete basic training. And besides, they tell him to look, because despite being from a famous clan, he's pissing himself with fear, wondering what use they would be to an idiot like, because he can't even be considered a low-quality product. Then he asks them to eliminate, but the protagonist tells them not to, begging them, please, not to kill him, saying he'll do whatever he wants, including spying, begging him to spare his life. And the protagonist remembers saying this while crying. He fought to avoid that, but he ended up in the same situation. But he thinks maybe it won't be the same, because this time, he ended up with his arms tied behind his back. And then, he talks to Soden, asking how long he'd been unconscious. However, he notices that Soden is not responding. If he is questioning this, it is because she is not in his hands. He supposes that he can only speak to the sword, possesses it. And then, that guy talks to the protagonist, saying it's incredible that he's a playboy without a Dante, and yet, he still ended up with his men, with that short, worn sword. And it seems he's still a son of a martial clan, even after losing the Dante. And the protagonist is already happy, thinking to himself that this time, his opinion is much better than it was in his past. And the blood cult is a bunch of pragmatic bastards. So, at this rate, they'll probably take it. But he feels like he's getting happy, because in the end, he's still being led by it. But he tries not to have negative thoughts, because first, he needs to survive before he can think about escape. But then, he decides to take him away, and the protagonist doesn't understand any. But one of them tells the captain that he is, at the very least, an intermediate product. If they raise him well, it will work out. But he says he would be useful as a spy. However, there are many guys with Dantian brain who would be more useful, compared to that rich kid who doesn't even own one, questioning if there's any reason for them to use a defective product, just ordering him to kill. And the guy starts drawing his sword, and the protagonist thinks the only thing that changed was his opinion, and he still came to the same conclusion. And it seems he has no choice. He's going to have to beg for his life, just like in his past life. And then he even tries to beg, and the captain is quite surprised, saying that he was trying to sound him out. The little bit he's now begging for, he's being told to stop thinking about how to get out of it, and to pay the price for killing his men. And the protagonist begins to realize that this is worse than in his past life. He even wonders if there's no escape, and he tries to think of something to at least buy himself some time, because he can't die any faster than he did in his past life to return it. But then, while looking behind the man, he notices something and starts laughing. He says that the man came desperately searching for a way out and put on quite a show. He asks why the man doesn't beg like a dog instead. However, the protagonist protagonist recognizes the sword of the man behind the and he says that maybe, just maybe, he'll end up using it as his pet. And the protagonist doesn't even care what he's saying. He realizes he's seen the sword, and there's a white decoration on the sword's hilt, and he notices it has to be that person, bowing down before him, placing his head on the ground, and saying that praise be to the demon of blood, and long live the bloody cult, saying that he is unworthy to be in the presence of the fourth bloody star. So everyone questions what he's talking about, and nobody believes him. And then, when they look back, they see who he's bowing, and the captain asks why all the fuss. He says there's no way someone with a fourth star could be there. However, when he looks back, he gets a shock. He ducks down along with everyone else, and the protagonist says that the 11 executives who lead the cult are the 4 venerable one and the 7 bloody star. He never met one of them previous life, but he heard rumors about the star, and sometime they disguise themselves as low-ranking warrior inspecting the squad, so the rumors were true. And then the 4th star commands him to raise his head. He said that this is fascinating as he had never been discovered in his inspection, and that is due general. And he asked the boy how he recognized, even though he wasn't part of the bloody cult, and the protagonist says it was because of his sword, saying that the decoration on the sword and the leather around the handle, well, he heard it was made in memory of his old trusty steed, Kurenho Bronco. And Genro is completely surprised, saying that he has sharp eye. But now, he asks him to clarify something. He's asking how someone who isn't part of the cult knows, and the protagonist realizes that he's suspicious of, although it would be strange it weren't, because, in his past life, he hid within the Orthodox faction as a spy for the bloody cult for 7 years. He's been in situations like this thousands of times, and he says it's because he has the blood of a cult member flowing through his vein, and he thinks he's confident, but he's lying, and that surprises the cap, and nobody believes he's even calling into question the existence of descendants of the blood cult within the Radiant Earth clan. He wonders how. Then, Genro just observed, and the protagonist says that his maternal grandfather participated in the Great Heretical Orthodox War as a low-ranking warrior in the Bloody Wolf squad, and after being seriously wounded in battle, he began searching for a place to settle with his only living relative's mother. That's how his grandfather ended up living in the city of Luya, and it was difficult for him to find a home while fleeing the war, but her inner wounds wouldn't, and her mother tried to pay for medicinal pills by working as a servant for the Radiant Earth, and that's how she met her father, and he was born. Genro finds the boy's story interesting, telling him to continue speaking while holding his sword. The protagonist is startled, realizing that this wasn't enough. He then explains that when he was younger, he underwent intensive training under his grandfather, and every time he complained about being unable to handle heavy training, he would mention the name of the Blood Wolf Squad's captain, No Jomin, and his son, No Sungu, and he would say that Captain No's son was able to complete all of the squad's training when he was his age. And everyone wonders how this kid knows the names of both the current and previous leader of the Blood Wolf squad. And the protagonist says that his grandfather always used to say that the cult would come looking for them one day. And even 5 years ago, his last words showed how much he missed the bloody cult. And Janho looks at the boy somewhat suspiciously, saying that he understands, saying that this explains how he managed to kill 2 of his cultists, even with a body that has a destroyed tooth. However, he continues talking to the protagonist, but the captain tells him not to make him laugh, speaking to the great bloody star, asking him not to listen to this brat, as he doesn't know where he heard that. But he continues talk, however. Janho speaks to Captain Go, asking who said he could interrupt, already with a very violent aura. And he says he didn't know that being captain of the Demon Tiger squad gave someone the audacity to defy the words of a blood star. And with that, he already lowers his head. And the protagonist thinks that for a captain to be scared by just a few words and a look, the authority of a blood star must truly great. At that point, Janho apologizes to the boy, but says that there's something he found strange, since killing his cultists could be justified as self-defense. But he asks why he didn't reveal his identity. The captain begged him for his life, and he says that was because he was worried that, despite his identity, he might be punished for killing them both, and he asked for forgiveness. He notices that he's clever, and even though he mixed truth and lies well, he didn't fall for the story he invented and pointed out the inconsistency immediately. And at that, the star gets up laughing at the boy, saying that it seems his joke was a little too hard, saying that in fact, he can understand his reasoning, saying that his grandfather was a cult. They are basically brother, and the protagonist thinks he was worried that something had gone wrong. He says that they almost lost an important long-lost descendant of the cult. He would like to accept him as a cultist so that he can continue his grandfather's legacy, asking what the boy thinks about. And the protagonist immediately says it would be an honor, that his grandfather very pleased, and he thinks he somehow managed to survive. But in the end, he volunteered to join the cult, wondering what the point of going back time was. Yes, my friend, some philosopher and some war book already said, if you can't join them, you'll have to kill from the inside. And the protagonist then, after being released, bows down again, saluting the bloody demon and wishing wishing long life to the bloody cult. And the star, once again, welcomes him. And the protagonist thinks he managed to survive, but in the end, he still came to the bloody cult. And if he had known this was going to happen, he wouldn't have resisted. But then, the blood star remembers to say something, stating that it's destiny to find a descendant of the cult, and that he'll grant a wish. The protagonist questions what this means, since a blood star would grant a wish to a mere brat, and he thinks it's a test to see what he'd ask for. And since he can't figure out his intentions, he decides to make a reasonable wish. And he says that, in that case, he would like him to return the sword, which is a memento from his mother. And at that point, the bloody star asks for the sword to be passed to, and the captain tries to say something, but Jean Romando doesn't make him repeat himself, and he hands it over immediately. And when he takes the sword, he says it's a bit old, but it's a good sword. Cuts, however. He needs to pay the price for having spilled the blood of his cultists, breaking the sword, saying that he hopes that, the next time he brandishes his sword, he will think before throwing it to the boy. And the protagonist thinks that, to be knocking her out with just a flick, his strength must be terrifying. He bets that, if he warns the boy, he might still be suspicious of him, but he's alive for now. And so, another cultist approaches him, asking how long he'll be sitting, and the protagonist says everything's fine, only asking to get his sword first. He says he's just happy to have recovered his dam, but when he picks up the sword, it starts annoying him, talking about his hair, questioning how he's going to fix it. And the protagonist asks his Dan to calm down, saying he'll take her to a blacksmith when he has the chance. But she says that if she could move, he would cut all his hair off, and the protagonist thinks that would be fun to see. But then she asks the protagonist really is part of the bloody cult, questioning why I didn't know that. And the protagonist says it's not a complete lie, but it's not the truth. And since it's her, he thinks he can tell the truth, and she says she wants to know. And the protagonist asks if she would believe him if he said he's 10 years in the future, and she thinks he's already crazy. While the boy continues walking, Bloody Star orders the captain to send someone to Luoyang City to investigate his mother's side of family. And the captain notices that Bloody Star is also suspicious, and he says that's right, honestly. It doesn't matter if what he said is true. And the way he observed every movement of her body, trying to decipher her intention, were the actions of a veteran spy. And whatever the case may be, he knows a great deal about her cult. So, they must be careful with the boy. As they continue down the path, try to understand everything he said so far, because he lived as a spy for the bloody cult for 10 years, but he was unjustly killed. When he woke up, he was there. And she says that to go back 10 years before death. He says that's really it. He managed to talk. And she says that it doesn't surprise him, that he's less of an idiot than the enrollé she knew. And she questions if that's what she thought of him. But she just says that he's really unlucky, because after going through all that, he still bought another 10 years only for it all to happen. And things could have been much calmer if he had just abandoned Song. However, he thinks not, because the only person who has ever treated him like a human being his entire life. He said that in his past life, a Song died trying to protect. This was a debt carried in his heart throughout his time in the cult. And finally, he managed to repay him. That is, if the kid survived that sea of shit he threw at, right? Because if he had even a little injury, it caused an infection that he'll never heal. And the protagonist thinks that now it's all in the he only needs to worry about surviving. But then Sodeo says that he's going to be a suck-up again after being used for 10 years. And that's when he finds what she's saying strange. And she says that's exactly right. Information is a weapon, and he is the best of the best. And he should know this very well, since he's a spy. And he already knows all the bad things that are going to happen. And that means he can prevent them all. Or he might just change the outcome for the better. And the protagonist realizes she's right, asking why he's worried about his survival when he has 10 years worth of stored information. He says this is a good opportunity. And as she said, he's going to use it well. And she says that's it. He can't live like this forever. But she remembers to tell him to stop talking so loud, and he realizes he's talking nonsense. And then he says he has many opportunities. He even thinks he can learn martial arts again. However, she is surprised. When asked how he plans to do that with a damaged tooth, he says that this isn't foolproof information, but even if it's true, it will still be in the future. So, they'll ignore that for now. However, she asks if, in case he manages to gather here again, he wants her to teach him martial arts, and he's surprised to learn, and she says yes, saying that it's a short sword technique, the one its previous owner used, but she must be the only one who knows. So he's surprised, because there's no way you can learn with a sword. However, she tries to say that she knows much more than he does, but the protagonist simply agrees. But while he's agreeing, his hand starts to catch fire, and he's surprised again by that blue fire. And in the midst of all that, he's transported to a galaxy, appearing there out of nowhere. He wonders what's happened, and then it's said that the universe will open up with the possession of the heart of the sword. And he notices that this voice is not Sodam's voice, and he notices something above. However, that something is too bright, and he ends up returning to reality. His hand was still burning with blue flame, and he wondered what that was all about. But Sodam asked why he got distracted, because he was working hard to recite all that, and he asks if she can see it, and she questions what it is, and he tells her to look closely, because he has spots on the back of his hand that look like the Big Dipper constellation. However, she says I'm looking at his hand, and there's nothing. She even asked if short sword martial arts are too boring. She gets upset, leave, and says she won't say anything more. However, the protagonist apologizes to, but asks if she'll be okay, because it will take at least a month, and she says she's just tired. fire. However, the protagonist wonders what just happened. Seeing that blue fire, just like when he returned, it must have something to do with the secret records of the sword saber. Then, after a long time on the road, the protagonist notices that the fire isn't appearing again, wondering what he needs to do to make it appear. However, he notices that the carriage has stopped, and when the doors are open, they tell him to stand up, asking how long they plan to keep him lying down, and everyone starts to leave. Then, the protagonist realizes it's too bright, and at that point, Dan asks where they are, and the protagonist says it's the Bloody Valley of the Sick, and that's one of the bases of the Bloody Cult, and also an educational center to transform children who were kidnapped all over the country into warriors. And he also says that the man on the podium is the one in charge of training the valley, the tyrannical commander of blood, Gu Sang. And then, someone starts picking on the protagonist, and when he looks back, the twins are there, and he says that he acted as if the boy knew everything that was happening, but still he was caught, and he is surprised to see Joba and Oh Hyun, and he says he couldn't find them anywhere, so he thought they had managed to escape, and he says it's good to see a familiar face there. However, he questions why the protagonist isn't tied up, and he says it's a long story, and Jobok asks him to tell him. But then, while they're doing that, Captain O arrives, telling them to stop chatting, pay attention. He asks if they can see the podium behind him, saying he's going to count 5, telling them to run, and Jobok tells them, at least, to untie them, before they tell them to run. However, he's surprised that the protagonist is actually running, and the protagonist says that if they don't want to die, they must do everything he does, and everyone is surprised. Then, the protagonist heads up, preparing to reach the podium as quickly as possible, and then Captain O gives the signal. While everyone is standing still, the first one in the back ends up dying, and when they see the reality, everyone starts running, trying to get there as quickly as possible. And then, Jobok notices that once again, things are happening as he said, realizing that it's really better to repeat all of Oh Hyun's moves. He doesn't know what's happened, but he thinks that as long as they copy, everything will be fine, and the protagonist is already kneeling. Sangwon says he's never seen this happen, and a child who goes into position without needing much instruction. And another woman there tells him that she thinks that's the boy Captain O reported on, and he notices that there was a report about the boy, and he claims to be a descendant of one of the cultists. And Sodam is also surprised that he knows what to do, and the protagonist thinks he needs to do this, at the very least, to avoid suspicion after his claim of being a descendant, because if he doesn't, they'll start yelling and use someone as an example to discipline. And she thinks it really does seem tiring. And then, Sangwon yells at everyone, telling them to be happy because they were chosen, and the will of the great bloodthirst demon guided them to the glorious bloody, and everyone there is surprised. And another kid stands up, telling them to stop talking nonsense. But amidst all that chaos, the protagonist thinks he's right. But then she says it's okay to say that. So, she says that, of course, they're going to use him as an example. And he says she might not have seen it because they ran. But the weak can die at any moment in the bloody cult. And she's surprised they did all this, taking them. But in the end, they're going to kill them. And the protagonist says that they're forcing loyalty fear. And it's quite effective. And one of them tells them to stay Latino if they want to end up like that, and everyone stays quiet. And then the soldier finds this gruesome, asking how he survived this in his past life. And he says it's not that he's proud of, but he managed to live obeying them like a little pup. And then, Sung Wong says that they will begin the baptism ceremony. And so, he says that they will start with the protagonist calling him over, asking if he knows what's inside the box. And the protagonist says they are bloody, and in that, he realizes that the boy knows them well. And then he asks why they don't explain to their comrade what a bloody worm. And the protagonist says that the bloody worm is a poisonous parasite that is implanted deep in the chests of novice cults so that they never forget their loyalty. And it is necessary to take the antidote that the cult provides every 24 hours. And if you don't, the worm will tear your chest up. And then Joa Beck asks how the protagonist knows that. And Sung Wong says that he got the answer completely right, and as expected of a loyal descendant of the cult. And then Joa Beck asks if that damned guy was a spy for the bloody cult. And then he starts making fun of him. Then he says he's going to make him an offer, saying this is his chance to prove his lineage and loyal cult. He says he'll have the honor of being the first to receive the bloody worm before everyone else there. And the protagonist realizes he has no way to avoid swallowing the parasite. But to be the center of attention in this life, feels he has no choice, and he will survive, which means swallowing the bloody worm. And he is grateful for being allowed to be the first to receive this honor. And Captain O, far away, thinks that Commander Goose seems to have taken a liking, even though it hasn't been proven whether he is one that he's a true cult, but he believes the truth will be revealed soon, and the preparations are complete, and he says he can hardly wait. And when the protagonist throws the worm inside, he makes the blood cult salute, thanking for this chance. And Sangan says that this is a response worthy of one of his descendants, asking if they all manage to see how it's done, saying that now, each one should come closer and pick up a bloody. And at that point, the girl questions how he managed to live for 10 years with that worm inside his chest, and the protagonist is not at all happy with that. However, he senses something. some, he starts to feel unwell, and he notices that his chest is hot, and it feels like he's burning from the inside out. She asks what's wrong with his chest, and he says he didn't know, because the pain is strange, but the location is directly where the worm is, and the worm, he shouldn't enter Frenzy without a reason. So, he questions why this has happened, and from afar, he sees Captain O, realizing that he did something, and then Sang Wong asks what happened, and they notice that the bloody worm in his chest has entered Frenzy, and Captain O says that, for someone who claimed to be a descendant of a cultist, he is suffering during his sacred ritual. It's too much, and the protagonist sees that he actually did something to the worm inside his body, and the protagonist realizes that he is in his wicked. Sang Wong asks what's going on, questioning if the cadet is alright. Captain O replies that he is, indeed. He must have stimulated the worm or swallowed, and the protagonist gets angry, assuming that, as if he had made that mistake when it's not the first time he's eaten a bloody, and Captain O tells him to get lost, saying he'll put the bloody worm to sleep with a simple kissing, and the protagonist asks if he's going to do it personal, and Captain O asks if he thinks he's doing it because he wants to, saying that the other cadets are waiting because of telling the boy to fend for himself, and the protagonist is surprised that it wasn't the captain's doing. However, he notices that the pain is moving to his lower abdomen, and he's ashamed, as if something were happening. He asks Captain O to step away, but he questions what he's talking of, telling him to look ahead, because he'll have an internal wound hits the wrong spot, and he tells him to tense his lower abdomen. However, the protagonist feels this pain, thinking that it has to be that spot. He's sure of it and needs him to stop, asking him to step away, because he lets out a monstrous fart on Captain O, who gets really pissed off, and the protagonist questions whether he said so, saying that Captain O was fine, and only after that does he burst out laughing, not believing that he farted. Look, I need to say that this worked. Naruto only beat Kiba in that one aspect, so the protagonist has his reason, and the protagonist wonders how long she plans to keep Saru away from it, because after all that, he says he feels terrible. Then, he also notices the bloody one, because the pain has completely disappeared, the blockage in his chest is gone, and this refreshing sensation feels very good. At that point, Jebuk approaches him, asking where they are going now, and the protagonist sees that he's calling him a pawn of the bloody cold, but says he doesn't know everything. Jebuk then thinks he's keeping a secret, asking if he's going to do this with a friend from the same city. However, the protagonist questions what he and he's taught, questioning what he would gain by excelling in the bloody cold. But then, Captain O arrives, calling everyone over, saying that they've now begun the rank evaluation, ordering them not to cause a scene or leave the room, and to simply listen. The protagonist thinks that another cap conducted this in his past life, and he wonders if this is because of what happened early. Captain O explains that it's quite simple, asking if they can see the caves behind it. He says that each cave has an examiner from their cult, and they only need to have their talents evaluated by it. When the test is over, they will receive a plaque labeled high, intermediate, and low, depending on their results, and they will need to give their best if they want a good rank. And his cult is entirely centered around skill, and he asks if they see the sash he's wearing, and the blue sash signifies high-level warriors in his cult, and a high-level warrior who has recognized skill and achievements will have their bloody worm removed, and they must be recognized and ascend, and then they will be rewarded. And at that, the protagonist thinks that everyone is filled with hope after his word, and little do they know that they are slowly becoming cultists. And at that, Captain O asks if he hadn't said not to cause a scene by grabbing the whistle, and the protagonist immediately remembers what that is, covering his ears from Jebuk. The question is what the problem is, asking why he did that, since that was a loud whistle, but there's no need to react like that. However, he ends up feeling, and everyone feels a pain in their chest. Then, Sodam asks if something's wrong with, and the protagonist says that the whistle makes the bloody worm in his chest stir, but it's strange because he blew the whistle, yet he doesn't feel any. Meanwhile, while the protagonist is crouched down and everyone else is writhing in pain, Captain O says he taught Wade about high-level warriors usual, but honestly, he wonders how many of them can actually make it, since at most there will be 2 or 3, and the rest will have to live with the bloody worm for the rest of their lives. After saying all this and causing intense pain to everyone, he asks how long they intend to stay on the ground, ordering them to get up, and says they finally seem to be in good shape. The protagonist thinks he's not 100% sure, but he doesn't think the bloody worm is in his chest. Sodam says maybe it's because he was covering his ear, but the protagonist thinks that even blocking his ears doesn't stop. The bloody worm is driven into a frenzy, and if only he had his dante, he could check it out. However, Jebiik says he's decided that since they swallowed the bloody worm, there's nowhere to run, and no matter how good he is, he has an advantage in martial arts compared to him without dante. He says he'll quickly rise to the position of a high-level warrior, extract the bloody worm, and take revenge. The protagonist wonders what this madman. While Captain O is speaking, Jebiik raises his hand, saying he'd like to be the first to take the test. Sodam asks if he's being nice, because he didn't tell him anything earlier, and the protagonist is surprised that it's because of that. Captain O calls Jebiik, and he already thinks he'll be chosen. He talks to Enro, saying he doesn't need his help, but ends up getting hit and flies back to the same spot. and Captain O asks if he's deaf, saying that he already said to prevent him from acting on his own. He's instructed to stay in line, only move when ordered, and only respond when his superior commands him. He then goes to Enro, telling him he'll be the first to participate in the rank evaluation. The protagonist thinks to himself that he knew he'd do something, but he's proving to be a real thorn in his side. Captain O asks what's wrong, as the proud descendant of a cultist might have a problem with that, but the protagonist denies it, saying of course he doesn't, and he's simply grateful for the consideration, already realizing this life won't be easy. He enters the building, and Captain O tells the rest of them to get into formation, and they'll enter in order. The protagonist thinks that taking this test again seems like something new, but Soden says he doesn't even have a Dante, asking what badge he received in his past life. He replies that it was obviously low, and low ranks are used as disposable pawns for various missions. Soden, he thinks this sounds heavy, and then inside, one of them speaks with a sound or noise, asking, and the protagonist already remembers that voice, because that's what he prepared, noticing that the person is younger compared to when he met him in his past life, but he's sure who it is, and he knows very well, and he's his direct superior in his past life. And then she asks him which squad he was from, and he says he was from the Bloody Wolf Squad, and he's the guy he mentioned, Zhang. No, Sangu, the captain of the Bloody Wolf Squad. And then Sangu asks why he's not answering, because he asked if he was his Anhui from Liang City, and the protagonist already thinks that this was a very clever plan by Captain Wu, but it's a pity, because he managed to fool even the fourth Bloody Star, whom he had never seen before, and fooling someone he knew in his past life is nothing. So he says yes, he is Anhui Wu, saying that he heard a lot about him from his grandfather, but he said that this is a very obvious lie, drawing his sword, saying that he said his grandfather was a warrior of the Blood Wolf Squad, and there is no warrior within the Blood Wolf Squad compares to his grandfather, asking him to really tell him he is. And at that moment Sangha lunges at the protagonist, grabbing the boy's neck, saying that he is courting death, and questioning whether he said that his grandfather worked with his father, saying that he was trained in the Blood Wolf Squad from the beginning, and he remembers all the warriors fought with his father. And at that moment Sodam is shocked that they discovered him, asking if he will be able to get out of it, telling him to draw his weapon quickly, but he says that if he draws it, it will only make things worse, and for now he will say something, but he sees a punch coming from below, and he manages to get out of the way, just barely, putting Sodam in front to defend himself, but he feels like his hip is going to break, and he doesn't know how a human being can be so fast, and if he can't stop this fight and have a conversation, things are going to go badly. But the protagonist realizes that his body won't hold out much longer, being thrown far away, impaled on the wall. He's already starting to vomit blood, and he notices that his cruel personality hasn't changed at all, and Sodam becomes desperate. The protagonist says he's alright, explaining that the attack wasn't a technique, and that if it had hit him direct, he would be dead. She tells him that if he's alright, he should dodge, as the old man is coming again. The protagonist suddenly feels dizzy and finds it difficult to focus, but then she realizes he's hurt his back. She tells him what he needs to do to block, saying it's a horizontal cut going towards his neck from the right. She instructs the boy to block at the exact moment, and the protagonist manages to do so, only to be thrown far away. Sangu is surprised, and the protagonist realizes he almost died, thanking Soda. However, he notices she was thrown away, but before he can catch her, Sangu steps on the protagonist's chest, stopping him there, and tells him to answer, asking who told him. He thinks it's a relief, as he was planning to interrogate. Finally, this is an opportunity, and in doing so, he speaks with the cap, asking if he doesn't want to find his younger sister. Sangu is once again surprised, saying that it seems he studied his life, but he forgot the fact that his only sister, now deceased, is dead. However, the protagonist says that Miss Noseiwa is still alive, and on the day his father was killed, she was kidnapped. Sangu was about to talk about the bodies in the scene, but the protagonist already knew, asking why Miss Noseiwa's body was the only one burned by the flame, and that the body was fake. He also asks if the protagonist wants to hear more about it, and if so, they should make a deal. Hearing him mention his sister's name, Sangu gets angry, but notices that he doesn't seem to be lying, agreeing with the protagonist, and assuming he's being deceived by the boy. He says he will listen to his story, and decide if he will make a deal with after hearing, asking where Sahwa is. The protagonist replies that there he is in the Moonflower Merchant Troop, so he is surprised by this, since the Moonflower Merchant Troop from the first Blood Star. And then Sangu realizes that the mastermind behind his father's death is who he imagined, and all of this was to incite his fury, control the Wolf Blood Squad, and the first Blood Star, Zhongliang, and he realizes it was his plan. But Sangu says that this doesn't make sense, since the wounds on his father's body were reported as something else. However, the protagonist asks if he saw for himself the autopsy performed on his father's body, and it was entirely done by the Moonflower Merchant Troop and the Bright Moon Commander. Then he realizes it's true, and the protagonist notices that he is weakening, and he will take advantage of this opening. That he says that the young lady is in the Gyunhai brand, in the Moonflower Merchant Troop, in Juzhong, and if he goes there to look, many eyes will be focused on, so he recommends that he send someone trustworthy check, and Sangu asks how he knows that, and the protagonist says that from everything he said, he must think that he will make a deal with, asking him to please help him with his strength just once. However, Sangu says that if all his words are false, no matter where he is, he will go after after him to decapitate. However, the protagonist says that he has already consumed the blood, and that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, and he wishes that he would find his sister soon. But he says he still doesn't trust completely, and a bad honor. However, if everything he said is true, he should disregard their deal, as he will treat him as his savior until his last breath. And the protagonist says that he is as affectionate, rumored, thinking that this is why he trusts the naked cap and follow him in his past life. However, he ends up noticing something else, noticing an intermediate plate on his hand, and Sangha says that he is qualified since he managed to block 2 of his attacks, and he is not giving it to the boy because of the deal. But then he questions if his grandfather spoke about his personality to the boy, and he questions if he would believe him if he answered, but he says that he can believe his lie, and at this the protagonist is surprised, and Sangha says that he doesn't know if he is intelligent or stupid because he never revealed his grandfather's name, but after being pressured a little, he started to tell everything he knew, and the protagonist says that now that he thinks about it, he is right, noticing that Sangha caught him off guard. This time, he says he doesn't know what the boy is thinking, but he'll trust him just this once. So Deo says that this time it was almost because she thought something bad was going to happen and flew away, and he says he was lucky. Meanwhile, Sangha thinks he's a very peculiar child, because to remain so calm in a situation like that, it seems like he's about 10 years older than he looked. And that movement from before, even if he believes his first block was luck, when he blocked for the second time, both his eyes were closed, and it was a very slow step to say that he felt what he was feeling, and he doesn't know how he can say that, and it might be impossible, but going on, it was as if someone was helping. And I think you know too much, Crown, really, I think you're seeing too much with that hidden Sharingan of, and he thinks he's imagining things, because for some reason, he doesn't hate him. Meanwhile, Captain Yuo orders everyone to move and get ready quickly according to the start of this plate and the intermediate plates. They should go with him, and when the protagonist leaves, Jabak looks at, saying that there's no way that's possible, since Luoyang's mule managed to become an intermediary just like, and the protagonist bursts out laughing at that its face, along with Soda, and while they continue moving forward, Jabak keeps bothering, saying that he can't understand, no matter how much he thinks about, questioning how it makes sense that he has the same intermediary plate when he doesn't even have a Dante on, asking if he received any special treatment for being from the bloody cult, saying that they'll see, and he'll definitely win the next test. But the protagonist thinks that this is quite annoying, since the two are exaggerated because they can't fight him. Soda is surprised by what he's saying, about him referring to the 2 of them, and she says she understands, since he's the captain, or is still in that position, and she tells Wonru that he'll be fine facing no Sungu. It seems to have irritated, since he kept staring, and the protagonist thinks that since the captain of the Blood Wolf squad secured his rear, he lost the right to fight him, and it's understandable why he's angry, since even Sungu said that he is definitely the descendant of the former leader. And he doesn't believe it, and Soda teases him, saying he got it for free. But she remembers talking to Wonru and asking what he's planning to do now. The protagonist says that for now, he has to find an opportunity to repair his Dante. She remembers him saying this before, but asks how he's going to do it, wondering if it's easy to repair a Dante. The protagonist says there's a way, asking if she's heard of the omnipotent divine doctor. She questions what that is, and he says he's a doctor known for being able to cure anything, and they say he'll cure you if pay the price. From what he's heard, he's already repaired a broken Dante on 2, and in 10 months, the omnipotent divine doc will come to the bloody valley of Isis. So she thinks the boy will pay to be cured, but remembers he left all his money at the guest house, saying that now he has nothing but her, cursing him and supposing the protagonist will sell it to pay that god. But the protagonist asks what she's talking about, and he says he'll pay the price himself, finds a way. Meanwhile, Jebik sees a strangely behaving boy, wondering if he should copy. The girl asks about this medicinal herb, and the protagonist says that in 10 months the divine omnipotent doctor will ask for a particular medicinal herb, and since he's alive again, he already knows where it is. She's surprised that he already had a plan, and he says that he's already reached that point, and he'll at least try to climb the ranks in the bloody cult. In the end, they're still human. They say that rotten people are rotten, even if they're from the orthodox or heretical fact. But as they walk, several people are lying in front of Captain Wu, orders them to stop, then questions what is happening and who did it. When he looks ahead, a man with tiger skin is lifting another boy, and he says that these guys are trash too. Captain Wu asks who he is, then the man looks back, smiling, noticing that fresh blood has arrived, coming in front of Captain Wu, surprising. And then, the captain orders everyone to stay behind him, but the guy with the tiger skin grabs his arm, saying he's in front, then tells him to get lost, throwing him away with a single punt and knocking him unconscious in one go. The protagonist is surprised that Captain Wu was defeated with just one blow, and this is crazy, because for a high-class master like the captain to end up like that, it would be impossible even a commander to do that. He thinks he hasn't heard of a master of that level in the bloody Valley of the Six in his past life, and he's very oppressive, wondering who that brute is. Then Jay Beck says that he killed the anicaps, but the protagonist only thinks he's not dead, ordering them to retreat. At that moment, that man claps his hands, and just with the air pressure from his palm, everyone flies back, and the protagonist begins to feel pain along with everyone else, who all double over, feeling a terrible pain in their ear, and even foaming at the mouth. And that man notices that they are crying so much just for that. He asks if they are animals too, and then Sodam speaks to Hanru, asking if he can hear, and the protagonist sees that his eardrums are suffering greatly. Seems they are going to break, and he can't hear anything around him, saying that he is getting dizzy, and thinks he is going to vomit because his ear is full of blood, but he ends up noticing something, wondering what this warm sensation inside his chest is. And Sodam remembers something he asked, even if he didn't say that at the time, with the bloody worm too, but the protagonist says it's different that time, because the buzzing in his ear stopped and his wounds wept. But then, the protagonist hears Jwabek simply confronting the tiger god, saying he challenges him kill, saying he won't touch his brother without first passing it. And the protagonist is surprised seeing the two like that, noticing that they endured that, thinking they would be better off if they had fainted. And then, that guy says it'll pass, and Jwabek doesn't understand any. But then, that man puts him to sleep, and then Sodam asks if he can move, and the protagonist says yes, saying he doesn't know what will happen if he stays there. But then, and he realizes there was one more, and while the protagonist prepares to leave, he ends up being caught too, this time, by a rather delicate blow. A heavy one to the middle of the head, and then when Captain O wakes up, Sam Wong wakes him up, and he talks to the Captain O, noticing he didn't arrive at the appointed time, went there personal. Most of the cadets were seriously injured, asking what happened. He says he's sorry, explaining that some savage person Sam Wong asks about, while he's saying a stranger did it. He confirmed, saying it's somewhat embarrassing, but the stranger was strong enough to take him down with a single blow. He was large, had long, messy hair, and wore a tiger skin instead of a shirt. Sam Wong immediately recognizes someone with those characteristics, and Captain O asks what it is. He says the guy who looks like the one who crushed and captured his son was that same guy. He thinks that because of his appearance, he must know the ancient evil heaven, one of the four venerable. They are surprised, and he confirms that's correct. He doesn't know why he was dispatched, but recently he's been living near the Bloody Valley of the Six, and is one of the absolute powers of the cult. Bloody, one of the four venerable ones, the one with the strangest personality, the abominable evil heaven. Meanwhile, the abominable one says that this is unexpected, asking if the protagonist is looking for that in his hand, saying that he heard that all the new cadets were too weak, but to have such a short sword, for someone who has no internal energy because of a broken dantian, to be able to withstand that, and to be the first to wake up is also too much, and he says that this will get very interesting. Meanwhile, Sam Wong and O are going there, and he apologized because this happened due to his incompetence, but Sam Wong says that he wasn't someone he could handle, and Captain O is worried that he will kill them, saying that they are not low rank, and it is difficult to obtain new mid-rank cadets, saying that he doesn't know about Wong Rue, but those twins possess the qualities of a superior rank, and Sam Wong claims he doesn't know what will happen, as he knew that crazy old man came around from time to time, but for him to lay hands on the cadet is too much, and he says they are getting close to his house, telling him to be careful with his tone in front of him, as even the other four venerable ones avoid confronting. And he is a monster among monsters, and Sam Wong bows down, glorifying the bloodthirsty demon and the bloody cult, introducing himself to the venerable one and asking what Captain O is doing, ordering him to bow, but they receive no answer. Captain O then asks if they should go inside and check, but Sam Wong tells him to wait there, as interruptions are not good for his temperament. However, he ends up receiving a huge blow, and he realizes it's a seat. The venerable one says he's quite decent for a commander, and Sam Wong says he's praising him too much, as someone like him couldn't even reach. He says he's stating the obvious, but then says that the reason he went there was because of those little shits. Sam Wong agrees, saying that to train and transform these children into warriors of the main cult, he wants to take. Sam Wong asks if he's afraid of hurting them, but he says he's not at all, and then says that these children are talents that they are useful, so while they are there, he is thinking of teaching them some tricks, telling them to relax and leave, and Sam Wong is surprised, because the evil sky is one of the four venerable ones. He's going to teach them, and this old man hasn't chosen a disciple all this time, and he understands that, telling the venerable one that he didn't know he had such intentions, congratulate, but he tells Sam Wong not to get confused, and he doesn't understand anything, and the old man says that this is just to satisfy his boredom while he's there, saying that he certainly isn't someone who would accept disciple, and he's simply giving a sounding tip, and Sam Wong agreed. However, Captain O questions what he's talking, asking if he won't accept them as disciple, but to be taught by a supreme master is a divine opportunity, and even more so by the evil sky, one of the four venerable ones. However, as he is still angry with Hanru, he thinks he can't just sit and let this happen, and speaks to the venerable one. The text next describes a situation where a young man named So Wong Hui, one of the cadets he chose, has his dantian broke. Sam Wong asks what he's doing there, and he explains that he's there to receive his However, he doesn't finish his sentence, as he flies away with a furtive blow, being thrown down below. The venerable master asks why he's bothering him so much, even after saying he'll accept, ordering him to stop talk and disappear immediately. Sam Wong understands instantly, saying they'll distance themselves, believing there's nothing to be done. He adds that it's a shame those twins were caught, but Hanru, being from the Radiant Earthland, thought it would be good to use him as a spy in the future. The venerable master then tells the protagonist they talk too much, and the protagonist realizes that's what the black and white ghost twin past life, and the one who taught martial arts, were that he was one of the four venerable, but he questions why he was chosen as well, and then he gets up, saying that he got hungry, and after talking a little, he calls the protagonist, telling him to find some food within 4 hours, and the protagonist questions if that's why he's chosen, but the venerable one remembers to say this only as a precaution to the boy, telling him not to even think about running away, because if he catches him trying to escape, he better get ready, and the protagonist notices that the smile is giving him chill, but he questions whether the old man thinks he won't run away just because he said he'll please him and will flee after finding an open. He says he will obey the elder's order, but admits he still can't learn martial arts, and without a weapon, it will be difficult to achieve any. The short sword he's holding is a memento from his mother, but then the venerable man throws the sword in the boy's face, telling him he's overthinking and ordering him pick it up, as he doesn't need a broken short sword like that. The protagonist simply thanks him while poor Sodam, all drooling, says that she used that old man as a toothpick, that it's totally disgusting. Then the venerable man goes to the two twins and slaps each of them, asking how long these idiots are going to sleep. The protagonist thinks these guys are going to end up dying at this rate, and after they are woken up by the punch, the venerable man drags them away. They but speak to the protagonist, who almost forgot, saying that he wants to eat meat, and it has to be meat, leaving there and leaving the boy behind. But then the protagonist asks where he went now, wondering why the wind is so strong. When he realizes, he doesn't even know where he is, and all he sees is a gigantic precipice. He's surprised that he has to find something to eat within 4 hours, since 4 hours is what it will take just to get down. He questions where he's going to get meat instead of. Then Sodam tells him to look to the side, showing him the venerable man flying with the other. She notices that he jumps very well, asking if he's really going to be able to escape. The protagonist thinks, and this discourages him completely. But then he starts trying to focus, because if he gives up there, he'll definitely die at the hands of that old man. So he starts trying to descend, but realizes it's very steep, wondering how he's going to get down, let alone escape. But he tries not to think about, but ends up falling hard, flying through the. Down below, he manages to land on a branch and thinks he almost died, wondering why his second life is also so different. Then Sodam tells the boy he descended very quickly, and he questions how far he went. She asks if he really wants her to count, but he dismisses it, as there are still many more down there. After a considerable time, she goes to him, saying that 4 hours have passed, and tells him he's been wasting time like this, that it seems he didn't take her warning seriously, and asks the boy prepared to die. The protagonist then says he wanted to see the elder, and asks what the boy said. After a while, the protagonist is down there, manages to catch a rabbit, and the girl is overjoyed, and he's already completely chained, with some very visible muscle, and she says he looks great now, and he says he's been living like this for 2 months now, and he should be at least at this level, and he used to get beaten up because it took him 2 hours just to get down the cliff. And Sodam confesses that she thought he was going to die back then, saying that he should have given up right time, and he got beaten up quite a bit, because he tried to escape a few times, and the protagonist says that this is all just history now, and she says that everything should be alright for today. He says that if he manages to get at least 1 or 2 more of those, everything will be fine. But the venerable one appeared, and the protagonist realizes he arrived early, as he was stuck climbing back. He gets straight to the point, asking if he managed to get any food, as his stomach is rumbling. He says yes, mentioning that tonight there will cooked rabbit. He sees that there are 2 rabbits, but asks if those are the only 2, because 2 rabbits for 4 people seems like he'll have to reduce the number of mouths to feed. The protagonist even tries to figure out what he's talking about, but the venerable one throws him into the air in one fell swoop. The protagonist notices that he's in this situation without fail, and it's not even a surprise now, as he's getting tired of. He also doesn't know what he's thinking, and there must definitely be a reason for him doing. For the last 2 months, he's lived like a slave, climbing up and down the deadly cliff that kill him with a single blow. The boy makes a mistake and searches the entire forest for food, punching him when he finds some, and punching him even harder does. After fainting from the beating, he's left hanging from a tree. Dan questions whether he threw a tantrum the first time he was hanging there, vomiting and everything. He says he's used to the beating and being hung up now. Then, one of the twins approaches the protagonist, who is also quite changed, much stronger, asking if he still can't bring food properly. He says that he and his brother were beaten for no reason because of the boy. The protagonist replies that it was a good attempt to blame him, saying he would have been beaten even if he had succeeded. He says the elder is looking, telling him to hurry up. The protagonist is surprised that he was called 2 hours early, and he wonders what he's going to do there. this time. Then he asks the boy to take off his shirt, and the protagonist doesn't understand. The elder just tells him to do it, and the protagonist thinks he doesn't. He manages to understand, and when the elder sees his physique, he questions whether it's been about 2 months, saying that now he's almost in shape, but the protagonist doesn't quite understand what he means, and Soden says that his body got very good after hunted and climbed that cliff every day. And then the elder speaks to Jobot, saying that he will get the food starting tomorrow, but he questions if that isn't the work of that damned South bastard, but ends up getting punched in the face, being thrown far away, and the Venerable One just tells him to do what he was told, asking why he's talking so much, saying he's going out for a bit, then tells the other to cook properly. And while the Venerable One leaves, Soden starts spending the bad gold, saying that he's getting balder every day. What the heck, don't talk like that about the guy's bald man. That messes with the dude's self-esteem. And the protagonist says he doesn't know, and he doesn't even care about head in the first place. But then the Venerable One returns and catches the protagonist dragging him away, and then Anhui asks if they can't walk, and then the Venerable One says that he's good at talking nonsense. And to begin with, he's trying so hard because he can't use light steps, and he throws the boy under a waterfall. And when the protagonist leaves, the protagonist questions why he keeps doing this and the Venerable One says they will find the man who will become his master, saying it wouldn't be right to see him so dirty. The protagonist doesn't believe what he's saying, and the Venerable One says he's cleaned himself, telling him to leave. But the protagonist says he only wet his body, and at that point, Soda realizes that's why he smells like meat. He only wets himself and gets out of the water. Then the Venerable One takes the protagonist behind a waterfall, and Soda is surprised to find such a place there, wondering who lives there. The protagonist says it's probably someone who doesn't like to be seen by others, and she even thinks it might be a super handsome master who lives in isolation, but the protagonist doesn't believe it. He thinks that for an elder to have a friend, he would ask to receive him as a disciple. That person is probably not normal. Then the elder says they've arrived, saying he was there, and asks the protagonist what he's doing. The protagonist, noticing the boy bowing, tells him that this man will be his master from now on, and the protagonist actually greets him. However, Soda tells him that he doesn't think he's in a position to accept his respect now, and the protagonist asks what she's talking about. She says that he's a little dead, and probably has been for quite some time. The protagonist then asks the elder if he's joking, but the elder says no, asking if he seems like someone who has time for this, questioning if he didn't know, because the changes that happened to him in the last 2 months had increased his strength after climbing the rock, and while hunting his prey, he developed strong leg and improved his stamina. While being beaten, he gained great resistance and mental strength, and even hanging from the tree was training to gain a strong a good center of balance, and all these things were to give him the necessary physical foundation to learn martial. The protagonist says he's sorry to say that, but he lost his dantian when he was young because of a key raid. However, the elder laughs at this, asking if the boy thinks he trained him without knowing the state of his body, asking what the boy even did if he tells him that there is a way to manipulate internal energy without a dantian, and the protagonist hardly believes that there is a way for that, and he asks if the protagonist knows what Jing Qishan, and the protagonist doesn't know very well, so the Venerable One says that is the first thing you learn when you start training martial arts, and Jing is a metaphor for a small, thin grain of rice. In martial arts term, the Jing of Jing Qishan refers to the dantian, and as he cultivates it, he will accumulate internal energy in his dantian through training in breathing techniques, cultivation techniques, and purifying energy. And of course, since his dantian is broken, his body can't use the essence, and the protagonist says that's correct, questions why. He's repeating something that every martial artist knows, and then he says that they have qi and shun to spare, asking what qi represents, and the protagonist thinks something is wrong, wondering if the method to control internal energy is vitality, and he realizes he's learned some nonsense, saying that vitality isn't exactly wrong, but the thing planted in the center of a chest. It has a real name, and it's innate qi, and the energy that is determined at birth is not accumulate, and they say it's twice as strong as the internal energy he accumulates through effort. And from that point of view, he's a complete loser, because the things written there are methods to control innate qi, and Dan thinks it's luck, because he'll be able to learn martial arts too. However, she asks why the protagonist has that look on his face, and the protagonist tells Sodan that innate qi is vitality. It's the life force of the soul itself, and there's only one moment when a martial artist uses their own vitality, and that's when they sacrifice their own life fight someone to death, and innate qi is not rechargeable, and if they use it constantly, they won't be able to live long. And in that, he notices that if he learns and uses vitality too much, he will shorten his life. And that damned old man questions whether the Venerable thought he would accept everything, be happy, because he will never do that, so he asks the Venerable to teach him a technique. So suddenly so grand, it's something very good, but that little one can't understand it with a foolish mind, saying he has no talent. And when he trained at a young age, he lost the dantian because of qi imbalance, and when he was in the Radiant Earth clan, he lived his whole whole life hearing that his talent was the worst. So, he asks the Venerable to consider. Then, he asks if he's saying he has no talent, after he spent his time shaping his body. The protagonist then questions if it worked, but the Venerable says it seems he knows something, since he's from a martial family, asking if he thought he wouldn't notice his little plan to avoid wasting vitality. At this, the protagonist is surprised, but the Venerable grabs his neck, saying that as he thought, being nice to him won't work. He says he'll have to make him understand that he needs to do it the right way, and he knows that if he can't even learn this, it's no longer necessary. He says he'll give him one last chance, asking if he wants it, to die with his neck broken then, or to learn and die slowly. And at that, Sodam asks him to just say he will learn, but the protagonist says no, because if that's the case, he will continue to be used around. So he tells the Venerable to get rid of him, and the girl questions if he has gone mad. And at that, the Venerable asks if he doesn't value his own life, asking if he thinks anyone will blame him for getting rid of someone like him, saying that he will never escape this miserable life. With the broken Dantian questioning what gives him the determination to speak like that, and the protagonist encourages himself brave, because if he wants a better life than that of a third-rate spy, he needs to at least know how to gamble with his life on the line. He questions if the Venerable didn't say he would get rid of him, and he says he's afraid, because if he lives like the Elder said, he'll live a miserable life and be used for the rest of his life, and end up dying in the end. And since this body has already swallowed the bloody, instead of living like that, he prefers to die right there. But when the Venerable hears him talking about the bloody worm, he starts laughing and releases the boy, because trying to deceive him even in a situation like this, it seems he's not just a little shit. And the protagonist doesn't quite understand, asking what does he mean by it. But the Venerable asks if he thinks he didn't check the condition of his body, saying that he knew about it the moment he picked him up, and it's best he doesn't show such foolish courage next time. The protagonist then asks why he didn't do anything since he knew, and he says that something like the bloody worm doesn't matter, he has other concerns. The protagonist realizes that's it, because if he really wanted to kill him then, he would have done something when he realized he didn't have the bloody worm. He definitely wants something from the boy, although he doesn't know what it is, probably related to wanting him to learn that. Then the Venerable says he'll make an offer that will interest, saying that if he does as he commands, he'll ignore the fact that he doesn't have a bloody, asking what the boy thinks. The boy says it's not difficult at all, and after he learns it, he just needs to have a fight with the twins he's trained. Nisota gets angry, saying that if he had, having said that before, they would have already accepted, and the protagonist asks why he would do that, and she says it's because it's cool, but the protagonist questions why, and the Venerable tells him not to ask useless questions, just because he gave her a break, because it seems he understands now, and he will take that as a yes, saying that first he must start feeling that innate ability, and when he feels it, he can go home. And the protagonist just agreed, and he says that if he is caught plotting something again, he won't just end up with his legs broke, telling him to remember that. And Nisota then only has a guess, but that old man likes Enrue a little. However, the protagonist tells her not to say something so scary, because he has no intention of getting close to that madman. But first he says that he will take a direct look at that text, and he has to at least learn it. So she asks if he intends to use it, and the protagonist says that he will use it if necessary, but he needs to check if he can learn it or not, because if he manages to learn martial arts and techniques of cultivation just with the text, why would he need a master? I'm starting to think that hack picked up in his past life will serve as fuel, and he'll have to go on endlessly. But feeling, while he picks up that thing to read, the Venerable One returns home, noticing that he is bald, and isn't stupid either. It's a shame, and if the texts were complete, it would be a blessing for him. But of course, if that were the case, he would have found someone better. And although he said that she uses innate ki, those martial arts are something divine anyone who learns martial arts would desire, and the protagonist starts to think that this is madness, and Soden questions what he's talking about, and he says that if you completely master the secret text, you can stop the reduction of innate ki, and so she notices that this means he won't end up dying from using all his innate ki, and she thinks they were lucky now, but he tells her not to freak out about it, because he hasn't even read everything, and while he continues reading text, he tells her to remove his dantian and restrict the innate energy center. And lastly, there's no last part, and he says that it said that this was where the method for controlling innate ki was located. And the protagonist thinks that the old man must have written this before, because that damn skeleton died of exhaust for writing. However, she ends up noticing something, and the protagonist questions what it is, because that old man, from what he said before, knew that the texts weren't complete. He asks what he's going to do with such an incomplete text. However, Sodam speaks to, asking why he's so sensitive, and questions how else he knew. The protagonist questions what she said, and she says no, saying that it's this guy who's talking, and he's saying a lot because he called him a skeleton. The protagonist is surprised, asking if she can talk to skeletons too, and she says not the skeleton, but that guy over there, saying that this steel sword said, and stopping to think, she talks to Rue, asking what he thinks about talking to the sword, what's the way to do it. Soon he'll be full of evil spirits, he'll get this sword too, and there will be two things talking in his ear. Then the protagonist asks if the sword can also talk, but Sodam is surprised, saying, the boy is an idiot, and it's not her, nor that sword, that can talk to people. It's him who can hear the voices of the sword. He then realizes that this is what the heart of the sword, in the secret records of the sword say, meant. Since martial arts manual manual to use abstract words in pretty language. He thought the heart of the sword was like that too. Instead, as the name suggests, it's actually talking about the voice of the sword. He starts asking what powers he'll gain after the others open. She tells him to stop being so happy and ask that guy over there, because he also seems to find it interesting hear them. The protagonist picks up the sword, and then the sword is completely strained, saying it's been so long since it felt a hand. The protagonist quickly drops the thing, and then the weird Sodam doesn't make any strange noise. He apologized, and when the protagonist touches it again, the sword asks if he said his name was Enrue, because he really did. He manages to hear him saying that he will represent it with the Southern Celestial Steel Sword, and that's the name of the last master, the Southern Celestial Swords, whom John Dye hates. The protagonist is surprised to hear this name, and Sodam questions why he's so surprised. He says of course he's surprised, because the Southern Celestial Swordsman was the famous swordsman who once made the Yan'an region tremble with just a steel sword. If he hadn't disappeared out of nowhere, the 8 swordsmen of the Central Plains could now be 9, showing how incredible he was. But he questions why someone like that was in Guangdong at the top of an unknown mount, dead like that. He questions if it was the evil heaven that left him like, but the sword says no, saying it was someone else. And even that evil heaven was unable to defeat the master heaven, and the protagonist doesn't even believe it, since he never managed to beat the celestial Southern Swordsman master. And he questions who did this to an expert like whom even the evil heaven couldn't defeat, and killed him so miserable. And the sword says it will talk about that later, asking if he doesn't have anything more important. And the protagonist ends up remembering, and the sword, the protagonist, aware of his situation since he'd been listening, and after learning that art, Kanato's cultivation technique, asks if he'll fight the evil Sky Twin. He says he would know if he'd seen them, but the sword says it does no, surprising the protagonist. The protagonist then says he'll teach the cultivation technique, and Sodam asks if it's okay to accept it out of the blue. The sword explains that it's related to the honor of his master, the Celestial Swordsman of the South, and if he loses because he didn't properly learn his master technique, his honor will be tarnished. Furthermore, he also wants a successor to his master's martial arts, and that's his wish. The protagonist questions whether this guy isn't kind of nice, thanking the sword. However, he begins negotiations with the protagonist, and the protagonist realizes he's not so kind after all. He asks the protagonist to become his new master, saying that his master's honor is important, but losing his existence as a sword is something he wants to prevent even more. And he's been very southern for quite some time, and he wants him to become his master, ordering him to pick up his sword every day. But then Sodam falls on top of beating that sword, saying that he's ruining all the sword, and the two start arguing in front of the protagonist, and he wonders if he should give up the technique, because the kid is bitter just thinking that this will be in his ears every day. And after a while, he says that he will agree to become his master, but if he makes that perverted breathing sound while opening his nose, he stops, or makes strange requests about touching, he will give up the technique and leave. And so he thinks it's a shame, but ends up agreeing, saying that they will start learning the cultivation technique now. And he says that the part that is normally called dantian is the jing below his navel, and it is the lower dantian, and it is in a different area from where the Kanado is, and the Kanado must fell with his heart, and his former master called that area in the middle of his chest the central dant, and the protagonist says it's the first time he's heard of it, saying that if he has the lower and central dantian, he must have the upper one as well. And the sword says that his former master said that the area in the middle of his forehead was probably the upper dantian, and he called the area mental illumination. And for now, what's important is to feel the Kanado in his central dant, and he doesn't need to think too much about it. He just has to feel the life force of the soul itself. And the protagonist questions how one feels the life force of the soul, and the sword says that if it's difficult to feel normally, it might be fast. He tries to feel it with his 5 senses, and so he says that the life force of the soul will be easier to notice when in a disastrous situation where his life is in danger, and if suddenly he does something he couldn't normally do or feel an intense heat coming from his chest. That's the sensation of quinine, and the protagonist realizes that he didn't do that just to improve his body, but he wanted to feel quinine from the beginning. However, he can only remind himself that that's probably not it, because he did the same thing with the twin, and the protagonist realizes that perhaps he's just a grumpy old man, and the sword says it doesn't know much about it, but it seems he's felt quinine. The protagonist says he thinks that's what he felt for, and so the sword tells the protagonist to think about that moment, the situation in which he felt, and what he thought ever. He should think about that moment when his desire to live was strong. The protagonist then thinks about remembering everything he's felt since his life turned to shit, and he's been doing everything to survive. He asks the sword if that's quinine, because the burning sensation feels in his chest seems somewhat familiar. Sodam questions if he didn't say that before too, asking if he didn't say his chest was burning when he swallowed the bloody and when his eardrums burned. He says that's exact, and the sword says that's incredible, because his former master fought for months to feel quinine, but to achieve it in less than 4 hours is truly incredible, and the protagonist can't believe that the divine celestial swordsman master of the South actually took so long. Sodam says that he can probably feel it better, since he died and came back, and the sword doesn't believe him, as this is a memorable and metaphorical way of saying that he lived lived a difficult life. However, Soden says that this is actually true, and they are not being metaphoric. The sword tells him to focus on the quinate, and he will feel a jing the size of his fingernail inside the central dent. The protagonist tries to look for something, and the sword asks if he can't feel it. He says that while he learns the quinate cultivation technique, he will naturally try, but the protagonist says that's not it, saying that it's almost as big as 2 finger joints. The sword doesn't believe him, saying that it's impossible and that it's strained, and he's probably seeing it wrong, saying that he should be able to move the quinate through his arm, the internal circuit, and in that state, he should use his fist to hit that stone. The protagonist tries to do this, saying that it's somewhat rigid, and Soden says it will be alright if his hand breaks, and that it will also be healed by his kanata, a type of sword. And the sword says that although he can't guarantee it, it's definitely possible, and the protagonist notices that they're talking this way because it's not their fist, but he questions who cares if it doesn't meet expectation, and just being able to learn martial arts again is a blessing. He wants to see how his strength is, and when he unleashes the punch, he destroys everything, and Soden can't believe it, and the sword notices that it's the first time he's seen something like this, because although his previous master's kanata was impressive, it wasn't comparable to them, and he thinks that with this much kanata, the training that follows the cultivation technique can be reduced by a decade, and it's as if he had trained at the gates of life and death for more than a decade, and this actually happened to the boy, and so he questions whether the boy is really saying that he reincarnated, and that was true, and the protagonist wonders if this isn't a dream, as it's beyond his expectation, wondering if this is really the power he had, and after a venerable amount of time, he has the protagonist under his foot, asking how that idiot dared try to escape. But the protagonist speaks to him he misunderstood, and he'd been climbing up and down the mountain for 2 months, but without any good technique, and he knew how he was going to make in time. But he said that wouldn't be a problem if he simply moved faster, and the protagonist even agrees, thinking he would have arrived on time if he had started half a day early. And then the Venerable One asks if he managed to sense the quinate, and questions why he isn't saying anything, asking him again, and the protagonist explains to him about it, and he tells the Venerable One that he couldn't sense his quinate. Furthermore, he couldn't sense anything, and thinks there was no way he could sense it in one day. And then Sodeo questions why he isn't telling him the truth, and the protagonist says that being impure in anything is disadvantageous, revealing all your cards is disadvantageous, and the protagonist thinks that now he is sure, because it is exactly as the celestial steel sword of the south said, and the quinate cannot be recognized by others if it is not deliberately expelled. But then the Venerable One says that he almost fell because it seems that he is trying to deceive to reduce his vitality expenditure, and it seems that he will have to show him because he will have to go all out and take this to seriously, saying that if he loses the battle he'll send him back Captain Yua, and the protagonist already thinks about this with fear, and tells him that's exactly what he said. And after the day he brought him, he came several times, and didn't hear everything he had to say, but it seemed like he wanted to get him from himself, and the protagonist thinks that this guy is persistent, and it seems like he's still trying to get him. And so, the Venerable One says that from what the twins said, he seems to be a target of, and if he hears that he doesn't have a bloody worm, he'll never be able to get past the level of a low-ranking warrior. And at that the protagonist asks if this was different from their agreement, but the Venerable One says that the agreement was valid, until he starts trying to deceive him to avoid training properly, and asks if that's not enough to encourage him to train properly again, and the protagonist realizes that's what will happen, and in that case, he has his preparations, so the protagonist tells the Venerable One that he said that if he loses, he'll get rid of him, and if he wins, he asks if there's any reward for it, and the Venerable One laughs at the boy, as it seems he still has courage, saying that he's right, and if he needs anything to motivate, he'll do him a favor, but only if he wins, telling him to study and familiarize himself with it while he rests. And these will be the martial arts he will learn now, and one is the martial arts of the Temple Wheel of Amuria, and the protagonist was wondering how the wheels worked only with cultivation technique, and this explains everything. And so, the Venerable One says that while the skeleton breathing technique is difficult for him to understand, the wheel arts are a well-balanced breathing technique, and most martial arts can be performed within it without much trouble. And he says that the twins also learned the martial arts of the wheel, so he shouldn't complain. However, Sodam says that surprisingly, it seems he's trying to make the fight as fair as possible, and besides that, he talks about another book, and the protagonist reads that it's the art of the star sword, and he says that this sword art is that of the skeleton. Or rather, his master used this art, and the protagonist thinks this means it's the sword art of the Southern Celestial Swordsman Master. But Sodam says that's kind of strange, wondering why Hayek Chion has the Southern Celestial Swordsman Master's martial arts book, and the protagonist even wondered he searched the body. Then, the Venerable One asks what's with that look, asking if the boy didn't like it, but the protagonist says of course not, saying he's just curious about something, asking why he has the manual for this secret sword art. Hayek Chion doesn't like this very much, saying it was just given to him. However, the sword says it's a lie, and he knew knew it had been stolen, and as expected, he's the culprit, saying he tried to use the star sword art to defeat former man. The protagonist is surprised that he stole it, and Sodam says it seems that crazy old man really wanted to win, but the sword says that even so, Hayek Cheon told him he'll show him the star sword art, and the protagonist said yes, saying that he said he'll show it every 3 days starting tomorrow. However, the sword says that if he manages to show it, it means he has completely mastered the art of the sword. He must have reinforced his martial arts, using the movements of the sword art, and the twins will probably come to the fight prepared with their improved martial arts. And at that, the protagonist becomes thoughtful, while Sodam says that the old man is too dirty, and he says that he found it strange that he said he would try to make the fight fair, saying that it's obvious there will be a difference. However, Sodam says that he is a stranger and wonders if he thinks that will change the fact that he lost to the celestial sword master of the south, and the protagonist says that it's not like he was normal before, but then the sword says that it's because his former master, the celestial sword master of the south, died, and his former master and Axion fought nonstop, but never managed to definitively determine the winner and loser, and now that his former master has died, he has no way of seeing who it is. Superior, he's trying to win through this method, and Sodam is surprised because when they first met, he said that Axion hadn't managed to defeat John Dai once, and he says that means all the fights ended in a draw, and he wasn't lying. The protagonist says he doesn't think it matters what he does now, and the situation won't calm down unless he loses. He says he still has some time, and will try to find another way. Sodam then asks what if, while he's fighting, he loses his steel sword, and starts using the techniques of the 8 light strong sword to defeat. The protagonist says that if he does that, Axion will probably say the fight didn't count since he used a short sword. However, the sword says no, telling him not to worry, because the stellar sword art he stole was the version his former master hadn't improved, and after his former master's manual was stolen, he further improved the sword art, and the original sword art showed several weaknesses, and through his movements every few seconds, while the sword moves in the same way as the original version, the movements and flow were further improved, and the art of star swordsmanship evolved. Then, the protagonist notes that he understands what he meant by the personally improved sword art, and it's very similar to the technique written in the manual, but there's definitely a difference. The sword says that if he hadn't stolen the secret manual, his former master wouldn't have thought of improving the sword art, and it seems like a blessing in disguise. Sodam apologizes for spoiling the mood, but that crazy old man will only be surprised after witnessing the improved version of the sword art. He complained about this, so he won't ask why he didn't do as instructed. The sword then says it would definitely be strange to say he improved the sword art on his own, right after learning, because improving a sword art can only be done by someone with an innate talent for impressive sword, like his former master. The protagonist realizes this is becoming a major dilemma, because if he loses he'll be a low-ranking warrior forever, and if he wins he'll be questioned. However, Sodam says that if he doesn't use the improved version of the sword art, he will definitely lose. The protagonist says he knows, so he's going to use it, but she asks what he's thinking of doing, and he says there's always a way. After a while, they wonder if it will work, but the protagonist says it doesn't matter, and nobody would fall for the same trick twice, so he's going to abuse it. After some time, the captain finally arrives near the venerable man's house, saying that this time he's definitely going to get Hanru, and says he doesn't know how he got lucky enough to become the old man's servant. But now that he's brought someone to replace him, there's no way he can escape, and he talks to Dorian, saying that when he finds him, he must show the skill of a high-ranking warrior, ordering the boy to kill him. Dorian agrees immediately, and after that, Captain O goes to the protagonist, who greets him, and he says that it seems he has been working hard as the old man's servant. Then the sword asks if it's Captain O they were talking about before, and the protagonist says yes, saying that it's someone trying to get him. But then the protagonist starts wondering who the guy behind him is, asking if it's someone Captain O recruited, and then he says that the venerable elder will be late. But then Captain O touches the boy, but the protagonist says that it seems he's there with the supply of reactions, saying that if they can give them to him, he can take care of it. However, the boy notices that Captain O started using it on his body out of nowhere, and he says that this makes sense, and it seems that there's something special about it for the venerable one to accept, because it seems that his dantian is still broken, and he thinks that as expected, even if he uses it on his body, he can't sense his innate ki, and Captain O says that from now on Dorian will serve the venerable elder plate, and as a high-ranking warrior, how will he serve and satisfy the venerable elder? He says he doesn't know how someone like the protagonist managed to convince the leader of the Blood Wolf squad, but he doesn't seem to have anyone who has seen his grandfather in the city of Luoyang, and he needs to come with him to the Bloody Valley of the Six to undergo an investigation. The protagonist notices that he is truly persistent, but what if he were really that persistent? When practicing martial arts or contributing to the clan, he would be incredibly successful. And then he tells the captain that it's a misunderstanding, and his grandfather had to hide the fact that he was from the Blood Wolf squad, asking how he could carelessly reveal his face to. And besides, the venerable elder won't be satisfied with just one high-ranking warrior. And the captain either gets angry with the protagonist, saying that this is actually great, and he'll use this chance to teach him a lesson about his arrogance, and impress the venerable elder, telling Du Ryan that he'll take responsibility, then orders him to teach the boy a lesson fix his arrogance. And Ryan goes on the attack trying to do as the captain said. And the protagonist thinks that in the end it will be like this. And this just got complicated. And Ryan says that he has nothing against the boy, but he can't miss his opportunity, telling him to try to understand him, even if it's different. And the protagonist realizes that this jerk is treating him like an inferior weak, and he goes on the attack the protagonist, who manages to get out of the way of the blow, surprising both of them. Notices that this is the basic technique of the bloody cult's fist, the 8 blood fists, and as expected of a high-ranking warrior, his form is perfect. However, he is very slow in his eye, and although he has achieved 2 stars with the mythical star art, he didn't know that a high-ranking warrior would seem so weak. While the protagonist is dodging, the Venerable arrives, asking if he dares try to kill his slave. When Ryan looks back, he is completely terrified, saying that he pays respect, elder, but he is caught and crushed by the Venerable and is killed right there. The Venerable starts laughing, but he also grabs Captain O, asking who he is. Captain O introduces himself to the Venerable, saying that he serves as a tyrannical bloody fifth. Then he asks if the mere captain is wandering around and causing trouble right in front of his house, and Captain O says that's not it. The protagonist notices that he left a master behind, first-class martial arts, and he moves it instant, realizing that's what it looks like be strong. But Sodam says that even if he trains until he shits blood, he doesn't know if he'll be able to become as strong as that crazy old man. And the protagonist says that he already knew that even without her saying it. But while they are going through that, the twins arrive there, saying that they heard that he has been learning a sword art, asking how the protagonist has been doing, because he seems to be in good shape. Seriously, dude. Twin 2, what's up? What's up, dude? Twin 2, the guy lost all his hair. He's bald, completely bald. Shave it all off, man. Lose the war at once. It's better to be bald than to be bald like an old man. And at that moment, Joao Abika ends up noticing that the one in front is the cap, and the protagonist, seeing the two, is surprised because only a few days had passed, but their bodies had become much stronger, and he wonders how brutal the training and how much suffering they endured because the guy is bald. Yes, he's bald, and then they question why there's a body lying. Meanwhile, the captain asks the Venerable to listen to, saying that his origins are suspicious, asking to be allowed to conduct an investigation, but the Venerable says he doesn't want to know, punching him in the face and leaving him unconscious, saying that he had already said that his injection of blood was keeping him hidden, but he appeared there again to take, saying that he even brought someone to replace the protagonist, realizing that he must really be a target. The protagonist says that when he was kidnapped, he killed 2 of the captain's subordinates, and the twins are surprised, along with the Venerable one, that he killed 2 of his subordinates, asking if such idiots exist, since those idiots died because of someone who lacked strength. He says that the weak must die, and that's expected, but says that this is irritate, ordering them throw him down. Jobai asks if they have to do that, since they can just push him off the mountain and he'll fall on his own. Then he asks if they want him to do it, but he says no, ordering Orion to bury him in the forest. However, the Venerable one tells the protagonist that he seems to be in a complicated situation because being marked by these dogs is very bad, and these dogs bite and never return. That's their strength, an opportunity that won't come again anytime soon. Early on, asking if he doesn't agree, the protagonist thanks him and tells Jobai that they'll descend together. Jobai says he doesn't mind, but asks if the boy can keep up. He says that if he starts to get tired halfway through, he'll carry Captain O, telling him to leave quickly. However, Jobai surprises the protagonist, who questions what the hell is going on, since he's running down the mountain like Axie. He says the protagonist is too slow, and Soden asks how he could learn some Qigong techniques too. Soden says that would be great, because by learning the Qigong techniques of the Southern Celestial Swordsman Master, he'll probably be able to move like. But Soden speaks to the Southern Sky, asking if he knows anything about the Qigong techniques of the Southern Celestial Swordsman Master, and he says of course, saying he'll teach the Qigong techniques too, grabbing the protagonist, but he says that if it's not Axian's unique Qigong tech, it will be impossible to move like that on such a steep. So, she gets annoyed with him, and the protagonist notices that he's really strong, and he can see that, and in that case, he needs to hurry up and starts descending in his own way, because that jerk Zuabek, he wonders if he understood what they said, and when he descends with that body, throws it to the ground, saying that he thinks they've descended enough, wondering if he'll finish him off. And then the protagonist asks what he's doing, and Zuabek says that he's helping him now, because that crazy old man was being indirect, and he needed to let it all out somehow, and clearly, breaking one of his legs should force him to retire. But the protagonist pulls out a sword and Zuabek asks what he's doing. He says he thinks Zuabek doesn't understand something, asking if he thinks that old man would stop just by breaking his leg. Then Zuabek asks if he's saying he wants to kill Captain Wu, and the protagonist questions if Zuabek feels sorry. Zuabek says that's not it, but the protagonist tells him to get out of the way, because if he can't do it, he will. But Captain Wu wakes up, throwing Zuabek away with a single stomp, leaving the protagonist in shock. Captain Wu asks what those little shits said, and the protagonist realizes he's awake because Zuabek didn't block his acupuncture points along the way. And then Captain Wu asks if it is. So, he came to say he'd make him regret not finishing him off when he chant. Captain Wu asks what he's going to do with that sword, and the Sword of Heaven notices that Captain Wu doesn't know he can use martial arts now. The protagonist says that's exactly right, and he needs to hit him while his guard is down. Captain Wu asks if he thinks he's someone who doesn't even have internal energy and is as weak as he can hit him, then lunges at the protagonist. But the protagonist manages to deflect his attack, surprising him, and he questions how the boy did it. The protagonist returns the attack, cutting him and throwing him far away, noticing that his plan worked because he managed to use his internal energy. The sword says that was very good for his first time using swordsman, but he shouldn't lower his guard because his opponent is a first-class martial arts master, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the real fight begins now. Captain Wu thinks to himself that he thought he was sure when he used his ki on his body. He didn't feel any internal energy from it, so how did the boy do it? But while he's overthinking, the protagonist charges at him with everything he's got, and Captain Wu backs down, using the lazy flow donkey move as he flees. He's shocked because even if his life were at stake, he never thought he'd have to use the lazy flow donkey move, and can't believe he has so much power without flinching, noticing that the boy is dangerous and he needs to kill him now. So he starts cursing Honghu, saying that no matter what, he'll kill him while all this is happening. Zuobek gets up and questions when Captain Wu woke up and how Honghu can keep up against him, but the protagonist ends up receiving a huge kick, being thrown far away. The sword asks if he's alright, and he says that fortunately he managed to avoid internal damage, and he's surprised that this is the skill of a first-class martial arts master, as he's on a completely different level from a mid-ranking warrior. But the sword says that thanks to the first blow, his body isn't doing well at all, and Zodom confirmed that's true. It's more advantageous for him if they prolong the fight, and the protagonist thinks that sounds good. But then Zuobek tells Honghu to get out of the way, saying he did a good job holding out without him, telling him to now observe how he fights. But Captain Wu says he's getting in the way, telling him to wait his turn, hitting him in the face, saying he doesn't need to rush, and as soon as he's dealt, Honghu is about to kill him too. But Zuobek hits him hard in the face, and doesn't stop hitting him while fighting, as if he were doing a break, and the sword thinks that must have hurt quite a bit, and it's incredible that he managed to fight back even in pain. And then he says that compared to the venerable elder's fist, this is a cotton ball, telling Captain Wu to prepare himself because he's going to get his revenge for humiliating the selection test. And Captain Wu gets furious, but ends up playing dirty, spitting blood in Zuobek's face. And then he says that the boy is a real character, a damn persistent, saying that he's going to kill him first, and the protagonist gets nervous because Zuobek can't see, and the protagonist thinks it's impossible to block Captain Wu's attack at his current level. He tackles Zuobek, throwing him out of the way, saying he'll throw Zuobek away from Captain Wu's attack and take advantage of Captain Wu being out of position to knock him down. However, Captain Wu manages to turn around, and the protagonist plunges his sword into Zuobek's chest. He says he'll break the protagonist's arm while holding on. The protagonist tells his Dan that this is his chance, and says that with the 8 short light swords technique, he can use both arms freely, striking Captain Wu multiple times. He thinks he can kill him, but he realizes Captain Wu managed to block. Wu then says it's a pity for Wu Honghu, and that his Q attack is very strong even in this state. The protagonist feels his insides churning because of regarding the strength of his Q. Captain Wu says that it seems he has already used everything he had, and the protagonist says that he cannot overcome the strength of a first-class martial arts master with the initial stages of the stellar mystic. But then Zuobek yells at the protagonist, ordering him to hold his short sword firmly, and Captain Wu tells him to wait, ordering the protagonist to salt. But Zuobek arrives, stomping on the middle of both their hands, plunging the short sword into Captain Wu's face, who finally falls back, and thus, they realize it's over. And the sword says that if it weren't for Zuobek's kick, this could have been dangerous, and the protagonist agreed, because if it were only him, it could have ended different. And Zuobek starts to get angry, because that madman spat blood in his face, and the protagonist thinks that this must be Zuobek's first murder, and he questions if he saw it now, saying that he owes him his life, and the protagonist says that it's true, saying that the first-class martial arts master quite strong, and he asks if they won't face each other soon, saying that unfortunately he will win this fight, and thus, he will become the apprentice of that crazy old. The protagonist realizes that Acheong must have promised this if Zuobek win, and he says that from what he saw, he also asked for something to win, but says that it's useless. However, the protagonist realizes that he speaks as if he has already won, asking if he is so confident, and Zuobek says that of course, because if they fight each other, he questions if the boy thinks he will really be able to touch him. Then the protagonist asks if he wants to bet, saying that the loser will be the servant of the winner, saying that he is very confident, and Zuobek ends up agreeing, saying that he will go first. However, the protagonist says that he should help clean this up for Lee, but the boy runs off, climbing just like the master, and the protagonist thinks that in the future the last will be the first, and he's already excited. And so he talks to the southern sky, remembering that he said that Acheong's Qigong technique was more advanced than the mythical star, and he says that's right, because if it's a Qigong technique, Acheong is a level above, and the protagonist then starts aiming for something, as if the wish is in case he wins the fight, and then Zuobek returns saying that he did as he asked. And so the Venerable says that everything is fine. Well, but he asks why he came back alone, and he says that his Qigong technique couldn't keep up with yours. But the Venerable says he should arrive in 30 minutes. However, Zuobek asks if it's not impossible for Honghu, who hasn't learned any Qigong techniques properly, keep up. But the Venerable says that because of his irregular breathing, he must have suffered internal injury, asking who killed him. The boy says he stole Achion, and the Venerable says that's clear, and it must have been him who delivered the fatal blow. However, he realizes that Honghu was right, and he says that the opponent was a first-class martial artist master, and he managed to finish him off, only sustaining some wounds, since they were both there, and Honghu must also be quite battered. However, when he notices the protagonist arrives calmly, saying that he got rid of Captain Wu as he ordered. And at that, the Venerable gets angry with Zuobek, saying that the training will be longer from now on. And at that, Zuobek says that he's confusing things. Saying that he was the one who did everything, saying that he only threatened the wounded captain with his weapon. But the Venerable tells him to shut up, throwing the boy away. And the protagonist thinks that he probably would have been beaten less if he hadn't made up excuses. And the Venerable asks what he's looking at, and if he's finished the report, he should leave. And the protagonist agreed, but says he wants to talk about his request first, and he questions if he's talking about the one he'd like to have if he wins the fight, and tells the boy to speak. And he says he doesn't want anything more than that, saying that he's always admired his ability to climb up and down that mountain with ease, saying that he can't do anything if he refuses, but he wants to learn that skill. Then he asks if he's talking about his Qigong technique, and says he'll promise him that, and the protagonist thanks him, and he, all formal and smug, notices that he agreed much more easily expected, and the protagonist says that it only shows how confident he is, thinking he won't lose. And so he says that the fight will happen in 3 months, and Captain Wu may be dead, but that doesn't change the fact that he still has a lot to lose if he doesn't win the fight. He suggests that the boy train as if his life depended on it, and the protagonist says he will keep that in mind. He says he can return to his quarters because he still has to train those 2 idiots, and the protagonist agrees, saying that this Qigong technique is now his. When the protagonist returns to his corner, the sword asks how he feels after using the mystical sword art for the first time in battle, and he says that he managed to defeat Captain Wu somehow, but thinking about it, the first blow landed very easily, and that was probably because he had already suffered internal injury from Yaxiang's attack, and the swordsman confirms that's correct. And although it's not directly part of the technique, it's one of the 18 basic moves with a sword, and his former master supposedly killed Captain Wu with a single blow. The boy is surprised that he was so strong. However, the student says that since he won, he can now focus on his training, having gotten rid of that troublesome guy. He agrees, saying that the fight is in 3 months, and from what he saw in today's fight, Zuobek won't be an easy opponent, so they will train the basic sword movements that day as well. And the sword says of course, adding that if he doesn't master the 18 basic sword movements, the sword techniques he uses will be no different from anyone else's. Sword dance. And that's what his former master said. They won't start training techniques until the basics are firmly ingrained in. But then Sodam speaks to the blue sky, saying that he knows Honghu asked to learn the old man's Qigong technique, and he did so since he just learned martial arts, so he shouldn't be sad. The sword asks if he seems sad, surprised that he wasn't, and says that Honghu is technically the successor of the Southern Sky Sword. He confirms that's true, and Sodam worries that he's trying to learn a Qigong technique from his rival, Axie. The sword says he understands why his former master would be sad if he saw that happen, but even if Honghu is inheriting his master's techniques, it doesn't mean he's a replacement. It's normal for a martial artist to seek more strength and martial arts skill. Meanwhile, the Venerable One is unleashing his fury on Zuobek, who is completely destroyed, and says the boy is a fool, as he has already shown him the mystical star art personally. Trying to understand what he's thinking, Zuobek asks if this is really necessary, since his opponent just a Honghu, saying that compared to the Venerable One, he'll be much slower. But the Venerable One hits him again, calling him pathetic, asking if he learned nothing from the fight, since Honghu is training alone with only 2 secret martial arts manuals, and even so, he didn't suffer any internal injuries in the fight against Captain Wu. He's surprised, thinking this is impossible, saying he saw him get hit several times. However, the Venerable One questions if he thinks he can't tell if he has internal injuries or not, saying that he should know better than him since he saw it up close, asking if he underestimated so much that they can determine his ability, saying that he can't do anything, even if he hates the opportunity. At this point, Zuobek gets angry, because every day he's compared to Honghu, and it's always him, and he has to win and he'll make sure of it, asking his master to show his technique. Then he asks if he wants to come back after getting beaten, and he says that this isn't even training, saying that he'll show that he and Honghu are on different levels. But while he's talking, he starts getting beaten, and the master says that if he has determination, he should show it with actions instead of words. And then he says that they finished the technique training, and he's going to start teaching him, and then he asks what that means, because if he said that, he must have already chosen him to be his apprentice, saying that he will train to death with the Venerable One, calling him master. But he asks who said he's the boy's master, master. Meanwhile, the other genius is upside down on a rock. I think I know why he's bald now. But while he's training, the two of Sam Wong arrive, and Akayan feigns surprise at seeing him, saying he might have left supplies at the entrance to his house. However, he denies this, asking if he happened to see Captain Wu, and a cadet came there. He says he knows nothing about it and tells Sam Wong to leave, but he mentions Captain Wu. He said he would come today, but Akayan says with the bloodthirsty, tyrannical commander, asking if he's going to bother anyone just because of a mere cap, and after that meth, the bloodthirsty, tyrannical commander never spoke to or looked for Captain Wu and the cadet again. Man, if you say that's not a huge cover-up, just with the bazooka, the guy has the bazooka and the problem, and that name was never mentioned again. It's over, it disappeared, it never existed. And after a while the protagonist is training under a frozen waterfall, a part of it breaks off, comes towards him, and before he is hit, he pulls out his sword and cuts that piece completely before it even touches the ground, and the pieces fly everywhere, and the Sky Sword says that he still has a long way to go, and his posture loses stability in the middle of the technique, but Dan says that he seems good enough. However, the protagonist tells them to stop, because they always have to be strict when learning martial arts, and so he asks if they can go to the fighting area. As the protagonist makes his way to the location, he asks the South Sky to tell the truth, inquiring about his fencing level. The South Sky says the boy still has a lot to improve, stating that he's only at half the level of his previous master, but he's improved significantly in just 3 months of training, and he's done very well. He attributes it all to his teaching. However, only Dan asks about, and he replies that of course she does too, but she tells him not to answer like that. The protagonist doesn't like her insulting him at all, and he notices she's starting to use insult before people's names. She says she knows this fight is about the art of the Star Sword, but he shouldn't forget that in all the fights he's been in, the sword that has done the most is hers, and she's killed 3 for him. However, the South Sky says this fight is training, not about killing the opponent, and he thinks she doesn't understand. The protagonist says that there's no need for idle chatter, saying that through these 3 months of training, he only learned 3 techniques, questioning whether he can win with just those, and the Southern Sky tells him to relax, because all he said was that he's not at the same level as his old master, and seeing his techniques, it's clear he's completely mastered, and instead of learning all the techniques poorly, it's better to focus completely on mastering 3 of them, saying that he's strong enough, telling Hanru to trust himself more, and the protagonist thanks him, trusting the Southern Sky completely. And then the Axiom says that the protagonist arrived early, making him happy, saying that he will praise him for deciding not to run away, asking if he's ready to lose, and the protagonist asks if he doesn't want to wait and see, but then Soden tells them to look at that, and when they look ahead, they realize it's Jobok, along with his brother who is now completely bald, saying that they seem to have changed, and then when they look at Jobok, they realize that he's much more muscular as before, and Soden questions whether this is the effect of Axiom's martial arts training, and the protagonist questions what kind of training you have to go through to get that body, and as for Hanru, he's even more brilliant than before, and the protagonist questions once again, what kind of training do you have to go through to get that kind of head? And then Axiom asks if it's obvious just by looking that the twins have gotten stronger, and the protagonist says he doesn't think that's all there is to it. Then Axiom says the rules are simple, there are no surrender, and the fight will continue until the opponent is completely unable to fight, and there's no sparing a life in the middle of the battle. The protagonist says he understands, asking who he's going to fight, and Jobok says it's obviously. The protagonist thinks that thankfully it won't be 2 against, but he questions what that is, and then he has something in his hand, a glove made of iron. Jobok asks what he's looking at, asking if he thinks it's fair to use a sword while he uses his bare hand, saying it's nothing special since the old man said he did fight young. The protagonist just agreed, waving his sword, but says that his fists seem much better than his rusty steel sword. But even so, if the old man's literary theory of martial arts, the Book of Martial Arts of the Black Steel, strengthens his physical ability, it must be necessary for this to fair, and they realize that he is subtly ignoring the martial arts of the Axiom. And at that point Jobok completely loses his patience, going after the protagonist, saying he's going to get him, and the protagonist realizes that he's simple, because if he's advancing towards him, he'll use the reach advantage of a sword's and as soon as he's within reach, he uses the art of the Star Sword, the first law, Tiger Tooth Sword Strike, attacking Jobok with everything, and the boy can only defend himself, and the Axiom realizes what that strike is, because he can clearly see the form of the technique, noting that it seems he wasn't lazy in his training, but he won't be able to beat him with just that, and at that point Jobok manages to grab the protagonist's wrist, and he starts punching the boy with his other hand, asking if that reminded him of the old time, trying to kill the protagonist with a cross, but as soon as he strikes, the protagonist ducks and hits him with a powerful kick to the chin, turning the table. The protagonist thinks he's barely managed to get out of his reach and needs to use this time to do something, but Jobok attacks, kneeing the protagonist and throwing him far away. He questions what kind of lousy swordsman uses his foot, but the protagonist starts saying that the difference between his internal energy 3 months ago and now is like the distance from heaven to earth, asking if he took some miracle drug. Jobok questions what he's talking, and it's just because he learned learned the old man's martial arts proper. However, the protagonist, observing him, realizes he's blatantly lying because his pupils are trembling, and he thinks that for a moment he forgot the reason and the history of this fight. And he says that in 10 years, this bastard and his younger twin will be one of the strongest forces in the bloody cult, the black and white twin ghosts, and he may seem like a weakling now, but he will continue to receive all the material and emotional support and everything, not just in martial. Nothing was in his favor, and the protagonist recognizes that he was thinking wrong, and Jobok tries to understand what he's saying, but he says he's going all out. And Jobok gets scared, and the protagonist, he really goes cutting him. And Zian is surprised to see, and Jobok can't even see it, questioning what happened since he couldn't see anything. Zian tries to remain indifferent, and the protagonist notices that, but his facial expression has changed, and he questions what he thinks now that the tables have turned, noting that he couldn't have predicted it, and it's too early for him to be surprised, because the Real fight begins now. Sometime before, while Zian was still training the boy, he asks Jobok if he still doesn't understand, saying that for a fist to fight against a sword, it needs to get closer every time its opponent makes a move flex. He says he knows this, but the attack he made is so fast that he didn't even see it. He then questions if the boy can't see, saying that he will keep hitting him until he can see. Jobok says he knows because he has been beaten by the star sword technique several times, and that attack was definitely cut from the empty stream, but he was on the same level as the elder Axion, and nobody taught him. And yet the boy managed to become so strong, and the protagonist talks to Jobok, asking why he isn't getting up, questioning if the boy gave up, and he gets up immediately, saying that this is nothing, and he continues to belittle Enro, saying that a loser like him dares to mock, thinking that he was trained by the supreme elder Axion himself, and he experienced the technique of the star sword every day and trained like crazy, and he won't lower his guard again and will fight with full force, telling the protagonist to come down hard, and Axion likes that, and the sword thinks that Jobok managed to inherit Axion's martial arts perfect, and Sodam asks if he is indestructible, asking how that attack only left a scratch, and then the sword thinks that in that case, he thinks Enrui will have to follow the plan, so the two return to the protagonist clash, and then attacks again. Jobok pays attention to the sword, thinking that as soon as the energy gathers, it will make a noise. It's the first technique of the star sword art, the tiger tooth sword strike. He thinks everything is fine because, although it's difficult to see the entire trajectory, he'll be able to block if he knows the movement. He's been hit a few times, but only suffered scratches, and he can move well. The protagonist thinks that even if he goes all out, he already knows the movements, so he can block easily. He also did a great job learning Axion's King Kong, and it's not easy to take this guy down. He wonders if he should just focus on the attack, going after, and Jobok realizes it's the tiger tooth sword strike, noticing that he uses violent pressure to subdue the opponent. But between the movements, there are parts that allow you to close the distance. He'll slowly approach and throw a series of punches, and he thinks the turning point is near. This is the third technique of the star sword art, the void flow cut, and the boy thinks that the void flow cut uses light and unpredictable attack to confuse his opponent. Instead of deflecting them one by one, he'll just get close and move forward. He thinks it worked, and then the protagonist starts walking back, and he questions whether the boy is trying to create distance. P thinking to himself that on Rue's technique very obvious, and using the other hand and the horse stance to gain balance. This is the second law of the star sword technique, and the hidden frog cut, where the user takes the enemy's attack counterattack in an explosion, but he won't be able to take down the enemy if the user can't predict the trajectory of the enemy's attack. So when the protagonist starts to become somewhat destabilized, Jobai thinks he's lost his balance, and now is his chance. But when he attacks the protagonist, he thinks it worked, believing he's completely destroyed the star sword technique, and asks what Enrui will do now, since he knows all the weaknesses of his technique, so it won't work against him. The South Sky thinks it was a great job by the protagonist, because although he had more difficulty than expected, the plan is going very well so far, and Soden orders him to start the counter. However, the protagonist thinks that he's the one who needs to fight and get beaten, and despite having prepared for it, it still hurts. But the South Sky, he tells him to relax, saying there's nothing to worry about, as these types of wounds can be healed quickly with innate energy cultivation. However, he says he's still in pain, but with this, he's already shown him that the star sword technique written in the secret manual has been defeated. If he still uses that defeated technique, he'd be an idiot. Even if he uses the improved star sword technique now, he can say he invented it on the spot because of the currently disadvantageous situation, and no one will suspect any. Jobai, in turn, defends the protagonist's attack, just waiting for him to go ahead and try to attack, because if he tries, it will go badly. However, the protagonist changes completely, and he notices that the movements of the void flow fortress have become even sharper, making it impossible to predict. Axion himself also gets up startled, and the boy realizes that the movements have changed, asking the protagonist what he... The protagonist says he changed the star sword technique a little, since he managed to block so well. Well, asking if the boy liked, Jobai is surprised that he changed his technique on the spot, saying that it seems impossible, but it's happening right in front of him, and the protagonist starts smiling while delivering all those blows. Then Jobai thinks that the tiger's strength blade attacks have become so much stronger that it's become harder to close the distance, but he thinks that doesn't matter, because there will be moments when he can close the distance while trying to use the tiger tooth sword strike consecutively. He'll close the distance at that moment and thinks that now is the time, attacking the protagonist. However, the protagonist simply stops his punch with his hand, and he notices that he balanced himself by stretching out his left hand while gaining distance. And at that moment, he took advantage of the enemy's attack. The second technique of the star sword, the hidden frog slap, attacking and throwing Jobai far away. But the protagonist begins to tremble after this attack, noticing that the hidden frog slash hit perfect. But he questions why his hand took the damage, as it seems he hit a piece of iron, and he looks at Jobai, asking what form this is, because the boy is simply bronze color, and seeing that he dropped his protective equipment, the protagonist becomes worried, and Zelda Soul speaks with Unrui. Saying that this is body protection, the protagonist is surprised by the strange blood, and he says that because of his condition, the fight will be completely different from before, telling him his distance. Jebek then speaks to the protagonist, asking where he's looking, giving the boy no chance to react. He immediately receives the first cut on his face, and the protagonist realizes that this is incredible speed. It's always been good because of his master's use of Kegon, but now he's even faster. This punch was a warning. If it were full force, he wouldn't be able to dodge. He didn't expect a battle of this level to happen, and he'll have to use his trump card. While Jebek comes at him, the protagonist also faces him head-on, landing several blows. But Jebek says it's the tiger tooth sword strike again, saying it's useless, and he ends up hitting the protagonist and throwing him far away. The protagonist can barely get up, surprised by the overwhelming pressure, noticing that he's become strong. Meanwhile, Jebek, he comes spinning towards him, preparing for a kick, but the protagonist puts his sword in front, managing to fend. He thinks he's barely created an opening to counter it, and uses the second technique of the star sword art, the hidden frog cut, throwing Jebek far away. But even with that, he manages to withstand the damage and thinks he doesn't have much time left, since he uses the hidden frog cut every time he gets close. Then he questions what's going on, throwing a pile of rocks at the protagonist, making him lose time while wondering if there's some kind of trick. He thinks he's getting impatient, but Jebek appears behind him, and the protagonist barely defends, putting his sword in front once more to stop his attack. However, he asks Jebek if he's alright, because the boy's face doesn't look good at all. Jebek asks if he's worried about, telling him not to get distracted. Then the Southern Sky speaks to Unrui, saying that this could be dangerous, and he thinks it's best to end this quick before it gets worse, and the protagonist says he doesn't think he can last much longer. However, the Southern Sky says it's not dangerous for him. It's dangerous for Jobok, because he has seen Axion's blood body protection several times, like his former master, but his skin never swelled with pieces of his own body, deteriorating like now, and surely, this is an ability beyond his capability. If the fight continued, he could die, and the protagonist says he understands, but still, he tries to use the tiger tooth sword strike and the empty flow cut, and this is insufficient to stop. He thinks that if he can last longer, he knows he will win completely. In that case, he died, and he needs to win and save Jobok, but that's how he hits the boy, and he ends up passing through the golden skin, and notices that if he had lingered just a little longer, he would have ended up piercing Jobok's heart, and he ends up grabbing the protagonist's sword while he wonders what to do, and then he says that he already knows, and he has figured out how to solve everything. And then, when Jobok throws a punt, the protagonist grabs his hand, also using his life energy. However, the soldier calls him an idiot, asking how he will use the sword if he is so close. But then, the Southern Sky understands, speaking what he's going to gain by using their key power, and he's intentionally countering Jobok's pressure with his natural ki, trying to break through the body's blood protection. And Sodam herself is surprised, asking if it's possible to use natural ki so carelessly. And the Southern Sky says that for someone who hasn't learned the art of the Star Sword, this would be a major setback. However, the protagonist is succeeding, and Sodam tells the Southern Sky to look, because Ong Hui is being pressured, but he tells Sodam to look at their faces, and it may seem that Jobok is superior in strength, but it's also clear how he's tiring fast, and he thinks the protagonist is impressive, because Jobok looked like he was going to kill Ong Hui throughout the fight. But it's not just the martial art. Ong Hui demonstrated great understanding of the meaning of the heart, and with that, it's a triumphant victory for the boy. Kid, are you noticing that the protagonist has only been training the technique for 3 months? Let some time pass, and it's even good that he saved those two, because he'll be able to have even stronger allies in the future. At least, they proved they weren't such bad after all. He has that little rivalry, but I don't think it goes beyond them. And then, Jobok asks if he's trying a fight between key forces, asking if he thinks such a trick will work against him. However, it works very well, and the protagonist notices that this strange blood-based body protect been undone. He wins with just a little more effort, but then Xian steps in front, throwing them to opposite sides. The protagonist asks why he interfered, and he says he saved him from using all his innate ki. Jobok thanks him, saying that since neither of them won the fight, this battle didn't count. However, the protagonist is shocked by this, and asks why he didn't use the swordsmanship skills taught in the secret manual he hated. He says that's why he stopped. However, the protagonist says he's not as stupid as he thinks, and Zian doesn't understand. He says he knows he's capable of using the skills from the secret manual, and it's also obvious he knows how to use them and what their weaknesses are. Zian then asks if he changed his swordsmanship technique. The protagonist confirms that's correct, but asks if anyone trained him, if anyone is nearby, and if anyone could enter his territory without permission. He says he thinks that's his limit, stating he can still see all his weaknesses. The protagonist says he made a mistake on purpose, in case he asked more questions. However, the protagonist questions if he wants to know, asking if he thinks the previous owner wouldn't have improved his techniques, since people like him can still see his weaknesses. He asks if he doesn't think he would have improved. Then he remembers the southern sky getting angry, but he says that fight didn't count because it ended in a draw. The protagonist says he would have won if he hadn't interrupted, asking if he can't see it from his condition. Zian says nobody knows what could have happened, but the protagonist tells him to be serious, asking if he really thinks it was fair. He tells him to think a little, because he has half of a cultivation technique, and this guy, from his martial art, already knew his weaknesses. In fencing, he even used elixir to increase his internal energy, and even won rare gauntlets to and MESO. Look what he did, he won, and it was all rigged for him to lose, saying that if he can't acknowledge his victory, he should simply die, asking if he's just a toy for Zian, questioning if he really thinks he would have a chance if it were a fair fight, because if he hadn't given the elixirs and gauntlets, everything would have ended different. And at that, Zian starts laughing, hitting the ground and lifting the other, waking him up cursing. Jebuk, asking who told him to use that without permission, because he's sure he said he wouldn't be able to control it, but he says that doesn't matter, asking if he gave him elixir, but Jebuk asks if those pills he gave every afternoon are an elixir. Then he asks if he thought they were elixir, and calls him an idiot, because if he had so many, he asks if he really thinks he would give them, and he asks if the boy knows, because he taught him his martial arts, since he had never done that before, and it's because these guys have perfect body to withstand the strange bodily protection of blood, and the blood flow of these two is faster than that of any other human, and naturally, along with internal energy, very quick, and Jebuk doesn't even understand that, asking what these pills are. Then Zian explains that if their blood circulates too fast before mastering the strange bodily protection of blood, their blood will be poisonous to their body, and if they don't treat it, their lives will be short. He gave them the pills to help them better control their blood circulation while training. As for the weapon, he asks if he's really going to complain about while wielding a sword, saying that despite being old, it's very sturdy, very well-made sword, better than most others. South Sky thinks this is the first time he's said something that makes sense, but the protagonist says that even so, the fight was unfair, and as he said, this fight was rigged for him to win, and they are both pawns. But he tried to use a trick and almost won, and says that this battle didn't count and the agreement is over. The protagonist thinks that it's just Zian, a disposable spinning top, says he'll take this discarded spinning top and use it as his disciple, as it would be a waste to throw away potential. He explains that there are individuals very skilled in martial arts, known as martial genius, and when taught something, they go beyond expectations and learn other things on their own teachings they receive. This talent is extremely rare, basically found in people like the boy. Zian says he's decided to accept him as his disciple, and the protagonist feels honored, saying he thinks the power he learned from Soden and the Southern Sky seems like talent. However, the Southern Sky tells the boy that it is indeed his talent, and Soden agrees with it, that he asks if he thinks anyone else can hear them, but the protagonist thanks him, though he says it's too early to celebrate, and he needs to ask one more thing. He speaks to the Great Elder, thinking that even if he becomes his disciple, he won't be able to learn his martial arts, asking if he hadn't said that the strange blood-based body protect could only be learned by people like the twins with accelerated blood circulation. The Elder then says he should thank him, because he won't teach fist techniques, he will help him master his fencing technique, and he questions whether the boy knows that the Southern Sky is his only rival, and the protagonist asks if it's true about, and that completely pretending, and cheese in excess, the sword was used by him, and poor South Sky is wondering if he hadn't already been told, and then Soden says that he's pretending, and since it's the first time he's heard from the protagonist, he's pretending not to know, and it's best to get used to it, since he'll need to do this from time to time, and then he says that after the South Sky swordsman died, he's the one who best knows the art of the star sword, and will help him master, but the protagonist thinks he doesn't really need his help, because he already has South Sky. And then Kishin says that she's also thinking about fixing her broken dance, asking what he says, questioning if he'll be her disciple. And then South Sky says that she'll respect the protagonist's decision, while Soden says that this is a good opportunity, but the protagonist simply accepts immediately. And then the twins ask how much they're worth, and Kishin says that she can't expel them, incompetent as they are, since they learned his martial art, and he doesn't like that, but he will accept them both as his disciples as well, and they are all happy, and in that, they pay him respects immediately. However, the protagonist congratulates his newcomer, saying that he can't believe he already has 2 freshmen and he feels good being a veteran. However, Jwabeka starts freaking out, saying that they are the only ones who learned his martial art, asking if it's wrong for them to have as their veteran. Then Kishin starts laughing, talking to Jongda, asking if he sees this, and his predecessor has become his disciple, saying that the victory is his. In that, the protagonist notices that he is doing his best to look like he won some, and as for the South Sky, he retracts what he said to the protagonist, saying that he will no longer help become a disciple. After a while, Kishin goes to Jongda again asking how he is, saying that with this he can finally surpass him, but he says just one more thing, asking Jongda to tell him killed him. And then, South Sky begins to say that his master received a challenge letter unlike any other. The time, the place, and a flower were on the letter, and although his former master frequently received several of them, this letter made him strangely nervous when he went to the location. He still doesn't know who the opponent was, but he had a golden eye, and despite not appearing to be much older than 20, the fight ended in just 40 moves, and a person who would rival the 8 world martial masters appeared, and the ruler of Yunnan province, the swordsman South Sky, lost. That's all he knows about the man who led his former master to his death, and Sodam is quite surprised by this person's ability, and the protagonist thinks something is wrong, but Sodam warns him to be careful about what he said, because the Southern Sky swordsman didn't lose because he was weak, but because his opponent was too strong. However, the protagonist says he never said that, and that he's just thinking about something, but Southern Sky keeps looking at, and the protagonist just asks the sword to forget about, saying it's late and inviting them to sleep. As soon as he puts the 2 swords down, he thinks to himself, who tried to comfort him by asking about the swordsman South Sky, but the fight ended that way, and the protagonist thinks that, judging by the Southern Sky's react, he's hiding something. Nothing he said explained why the ruler of Yunnan province was in Guangdong, and why this Southern Sky swords, someone who rivaled the 8 world martial arts master, was so badly damaged in just 40 moves. Even if he had such a significant difference in strength, he wouldn't have landed 40 blows. Southern Sky said this, and the man who killed his former master probably had someone else involved in his death. This means that after the challenge, the Southern Sky swords was still alive, so he went there to recover. Someone appeared before him and killed the Southern Sky Sword. He wonders if the man with the golden eye returned, or if it was another individual observing the fight. It's impossible to know who it is, but their objective was clear. The former master of Southern Sky said he wanted a successor, but he wasn't good. But what if someone stole the martial art, the Southern Sky Swords, and then killed him? This person would be the only one to know the art of the Star Sword. And he broke his jaw to prevent him from speaking, and broke his arms so he couldn't write, and broke his legs so he couldn't run. And there's only one reason for going so far, just one. He wanted to be the only living user of the art of the Star Sword. And perhaps the Southern Sky Swordsman finished writing about the divine body cultivation, but someone erased it, and then he became the only one who knew how to use Kinato. And the protagonist is furious, because even though he wasn't an official disciple, he learned his martial art and is very angry. He can't imagine how angry the Southern Sky was for not being able to help his master, for being just a sword, and having to see everything happen in front of him. And even in their first conversation, he avoided the topic, and he thinks it was probably very traumatic, and unless the Southern Sky decides to talk, he needs to be careful not to bring this subject up again, and it's the least he can do. Meanwhile, she continues talking to and tells the Southern Sky that every time the protagonist tries to bring up that subject, she'll change the topic. However, he says he doesn't think that will happen again because he thinks he understood just by seeing her react. She asks how he knows, and he says that words aren't always necessary to understand it, and it's like a master sword connect. However, she thinks this is ridiculous, asking why he's acting like he knows everything about Hanru, and when he arrived months after. She starts bullying, trying to show who's in charge, and the protagonist wonders what that noise is. Then, when he notices Action arriving, the protagonist says he didn't see her coming, but Action simply slaps the protagonist, saying they're both very stupid, and he can't believe it, recounting how they dared to sleep on the day they became his disciple right after such a big fight, and the protagonist says he didn't know anything about having to wait, and then he says it's his first time having disciple, and they decide not to do anything, and he takes that bucket off his back, opens it, showing it to them, and he says he won't let them sleep until they finish this, asking who wants the first Seok, and everyone's eager to join in. And the next day, the protagonist sees that it's snowing even more than yesterday, and Jwabek asks what brings him there so early. When the protagonist looks at him, he's surprised and asks about his injury, and his face is all bruised. The old fool isn't strong with alcohol, but even so, he can't control his energy to get less. He remembers Action being furious because he was laughing at for not getting a woman, and the boy says he thought it was a joke. However, the protagonist asks why he continues to speak so casually if he's the veteran, but Jwabek disagrees, saying he owes him his life. But the protagonist questions if something like that happened, asking if he remembers the bet they made, and asks what he wants, call him veteran, or prefer to call him lord because of the bet, and maybe he wants to fight again about it. He even agrees, and the protagonist tells him to speak louder, and Jwabe calls him from his veteran, saying he was stronger in terms of internal energy, while his screen continues to mock because he doesn't know that he simply combined his energy to avoid hurting. However, the protagonist is sure he knows, but he's very proud, and he's not that stupid. Then Action arrives again, saying he's he's happy they woke up, and immediately grabs the protagonist by his underwear, dragging the boy up the mount. The protagonist wonders how many times he'll have to fly like, and tells the master that he's also learned the techniques of the light body. But the master says it would take too long for them to reach the bloody valley of the Six with the speed of his current knee. The protagonist is surprised that they're going there, and when they arrive, Sang Wong is talking to the man, saying that the heart rate reading finished fast expect. He questions what all these prescriptions are, and the man says they said it's the best case scenario. Meanwhile, as they talk, the whole wall is smashed to pieces, and the crazy Action asks if the divine healer is there, ordering him to heal the boy, and the protagonist just begs to be saved from this primate. Well, you already took the boy to the doctor, so you're not complaining too much. At least he'll save you. Just stay there and heal everything that's broken side. But then someone arrived, ordering them to stop. That woman is the blood witch of the bloody sect, Hanbeek, and she says it's been a long time since she's seen her uncle. Then she asks who the child near him, whether he's married or not, if she knows him. He prepares to introduce himself, but Action tells him to stop. Tamsin, as a blood disciple, dares to sit down while his leader is standing in front of him, but she says it's alright, and she doesn't want to argue now. However, he sees that his lord has finally arrived, and she says it's been a while. Then another man arrived, the sect's best doc, Monchison, and he invites Action for tea. Action says of course, that he could never refuse anything. The protagonist thinks it's been a while since he's been abusing the old man's dignity, and he asks if the old man is a god or something, but questions why his impression of them is different from what he had in his past life, because he thought he was just an ordinary nobleman. So Action says that he needs that the doctor go with him because they need someone who, and that he can heal his disciple who are lacking power on their side. And if they help, he will give him the leader's plaque so that he can come with. But Monchison refuses, and he is surprised, and he says that he has already received many things while treating other people when he was on the battlefield. And the protagonist questions how many of these plaques exist. But he has already seen plaques of people without a party, from John Seo, and even kings and queen, and these plaques must be like trophies for all the deaths they have caused. And at this, Action becomes frustrated, and he thinks that he must be one of the 8 masters who have already surpassed the limit of human strength. So he has no doubt what these plaques might be. And Monchison says that besides, if the problem is the lack of power, then they don't need a doctor. He has a more important patient to take care of now. And if you understand, he will return later. And the protagonist questions who this more important patient, and while Action asks if he will heal him, if it is a matter of life or death, then saying that if he doesn't heal this kid, he'll have no choice but to kill him. He asks if he'll heal him or let him die, questioning if it isn't his duty to save others' lives. The protagonist realizes he's lifted the kid, only holding his head with incredible strength. He says that if it's him, he thinks he can heal even his own head. The protagonist thinks the old man is crazy, wondering what the hell this is all about. He adds that it's a shame, but he can't heal his disciple now, and if he's going to kill him, he should do it outside as he's busy. Action gets angry because his bluff didn't work and throws the protagonist back, asking how he dares ignore him. He says he understands, noting that if it were up to the person inside, he wouldn't be busy. But then the blood witch steps in front of him, telling him to stop right now. He questions why she's blocking his path, thinking she's doing this. She must know the person inside. So he's surprised, and the protagonist notices this, realizing the atmosphere has changed suddenly, and he notices her neck is trembling. He can't hear it, but judging by her neck, she must somehow be communicating. Action then orders them to leave and wait for him, telling everyone except the blood witch to leave. He questions who the person inside is that made him so serious. Action asks her if what she just said is true, saying that if she's lying to him just to avoid all that will remain of the blood witch title is blood. However, she tells him not to worry, saying he knows she has no reason to lie to. Outside, the protagonist is wondering if he drank too much yesterday because only his stomach hurts, and he thinks that the person inside must be an important nobleman capable of stopping even the ocean, and he wonders when he will finish healing that person. Then Sodam asks if he can guess who is inside, and he thinks for a moment, because the worst part is that he doesn't even know what place this is, and since the elder master of the sect died, they are now disorganized. However, the southern sky tells Sodam that the question she asked was strange. Furthermore, he says it wasn't the first time, because sometimes she speaks as if she knows what will happen in the future. But the protagonist asks if she didn't tell him that she returned from the future because she had died. He is surprised and doesn't believe her, because it means he died and returned in time, as if it weren't a metaphor. Sodam acts as if she believed him the whole time, but the protagonist says that she didn't believe him either. She tells him to be quiet, and the protagonist just lets it go. Then she asks where he's going, and he says he's going to the kitchen to drink some water, because he's feeling a little unwell from drinking so much early. If he remembers correct, the kitchen is nearby. When he's inside, he asks who she is, because she didn't notice he just entered, and says she doesn't know who she is, but she must be very hungry. The girl is frantically throwing food down her throat, and the protagonist realizes what he's done, runs away, and apologizes for interrupting. But the girl runs after, asking if he's the disciple of that noisy old man, and she asks the protagonist to pretend he didn't see her doing that before, saying she's on a diet, and the protagonist agrees, but asks if she's talking about how she was eating that steak. The girl says she was only eating a little before she starved to death, but the protagonist says she ate almost all of it by herself. She says she hopes he can keep the secret, then tells him to get some, giving him money. He thinks she's very strange because she could simply ask for this favor, so he questions why she's paying. Meanwhile, Zian arrives, calling the protagonist and telling him come over. The protagonist leaves immediately, leaving the girl behind. Zian starts hitting him because he told her to wait in front of the main hall. The girl also runs behind the blood, and while he's being scolded, he hears someone talking. The girl says that if he says anything, she'll kill him. Right behind the blood, full of hatred. The protagonist only tells Zian that he couldn't find the kitchen, and he finds it strange that the boy was literally in front of the kitchen. And then the blood which looks at the girl who says she went to eat a little, and the blood which then speaks to the protagonist, saying that they seem to have a good master-disciple relation, and the fact that this old man has a disciple is really impressive. And then the protagonist is surprised, because out of nowhere the blood witch's eyes became kind of bizarre, and he's getting dizzy, and the protagonist starts to be hypnotized, but the flame in his heart does something, and Zian in turn grabs the boy's head, and the little girl also tells him not to look directly into the witch's eye, and that's what he deserves for being so stupid. And the protagonist notices that the blood witch can do that, but he asks how the master managed to stop her magic, and he asks the witch not to do something so stupid, but she says she didn't do anything wrong. After all, how could she do something stupid right in front of him? Then she says they're leaving for now, saying she hopes to see him again, but then he thinks she's annoying, saying she needs to find a way to cure him, or find a plant that does it, and the protagonist thinks it's a leather plant, and it's true, and if he's not mistaken, it's a medicinal herb that the doctor was looking for, and Zian says that the doctor will give his name tag if someone finds that medicinal plant, so if he finds it, he can be treated. And the protagonist thinks that luckily he knows where that plant is there, and Zian says that she ended up involving the young lady in this, and the protagonist doesn't even understand who she is, and then Zian says that she's going to tell him anyway. If she says it out loud, he might even die, and asks if he remembers that there was a person inside that doctor's room, and that person is the granddaughter of the former leader who died recently, and the protagonist is surprised that the blood demon lineage continues to live on, and this is information he didn't know even before he died. And the protagonist then talks about the blood demon, and a large part of the history of martial arts that manages to bring together all kinds of sects, unorthodox and evil martial artists create the blood sect, and orthodox formed an alliance in order to defeat the blood sect, and the one star, who was supposedly the most powerful force of that time, entered the political battle. And all this happened because of a single person, the blood demon, and after a fierce battle, the blood demon lost his life to countless masters, and the martial alliance and the one star made sure to kill all his relatives, with the goal of ensuring that the blood cult would never rise again. And that was all he knew until now, and to think that he would see a relative of the blood demon so closely is too much. So Soden realizes that this is why that crazy old man accepted all the offers from the divine healer, and the protagonist says that it's true because he was even looking at his past life with his disciple, and he realizes that this is the chance to become a savior for someone who could be the next leader. But he questions whether it would be enough, because if he doesn't get stronger, he will be under the control of someone stronger, even if he seized a better opportunity. However, Soden asks if he's going to look for the herb or not, and he says he will look for it, questioning why he would miss an opportunity. She says that's true, saying that good connections are important, and he agreed. Then she asks why he's relaxing now, because if someone else finds the herb, he'll be angry. He says he can't find it right now, explaining that he won't be able to see it because the flower is buried, and it took the divine healer 4 days to find it because he didn't know that. Once the sun sets and the other people leave, they will immediately go look, and he actually does, saying he feels good because in his past life, he used to be very envious of the qigong everyone else practiced. At that moment, the sword speaks to the protagonist, but he affirms that he already knew, and he thought everyone had left, but someone is following. He asks if the sword knows who it is, and the sword says that's incredible, revealing that it's the fat woman they saw before. She's almost as fast as him, and the protagonist asks if that's possible, because even if she trained her skills a lot, she wouldn't be able to run very fast with that body, and they'll be able to lose her if they linger, and he'll drop a pile of snow on her. And the girl is surprised that the protagonist blocked her visibility. While her vision is blocked, he climbs the tree to be able to lose her, thinking that even if she actually finds him later, there will be a great distance between them. But the sword says it's above him, and the girl is indeed there, well prepared, ready for him to attack, and the protagonist didn't know. She tells him to stop immediately, so he ends up receiving an attack on the sword, but asks her to wait, questioning why she's attacking. He then begins to realize that this woman is better than, and she thinks it's strange, because she heard he has a problem with his energy core, but he's using Kegong very well. She then attacks him again, and he wonders what kind of technique this is, because her movements are like a hawk gliding in the air, and the martial arts that paint the tips of her fingers red make him think she's a martial artist from the blood demon. He thinks it will actually be worse for him if this continues, thinking it would be impossible to defeat him, and he will then have to try to resolve it with words. He attacks the girl again, throwing snow in her face, and he realizes that with that much force he missed on purpose, and he questions why she's following since she scared him. She apologizes, but says he was going somewhere at night in a great hurry, so she followed him, and he wasn't going to stop when she told him. But he asks if that's the reason she attacked, and why he mattered where he's going. She says of course he mattered, because because he knows where the herb is. Nissa, the protagonist, questions how she knows, but outwardly asks what she's talking about. Jonah wouldn't be out in the middle of the night looking for her if he knew, but she says he doesn't need to be cautious with, and she is Rayan, an apprentice of the 6th Blood Star. She's actually a friend of the person who needs the herb, but Nissa, the protagonist, tells Rayan that she wasn't sure and only had a feeling. He won't be able to go today, and she questions if he's going to run away, telling him not to be like that and to take him with, which will give him all those divine doctor tips. So the protagonist is surprised, and so Deo asks if that isn't a good thing, questioning why he's hesitating, but he thinks that considering she's offering so much from the beginning, she doesn't know how to bargain at all, and she has an impatient personality, considering those silver coins for, thinking it will be more advantageous for him to make things a little more difficult. Then the girl starts saying that just in case he thinks about running away, he should know that she's faster than him, but the protagonist asks why they don't do it another way, saying that they'll add another condition to further solidify his trust, and she questions what he's talking, and he asks her to teach him how he did that gliding move for, because he'll say it's an advance payment, but she says he should know it's very rude to ask about another martial artist's technique, and the protagonist says he knows, but if she doesn't want to, then he'll leave, thinking she's going to teach him, and that's the kind of person, so she says that's fine, but she'll teach him on one condition, saying that he can only use this technique on those who have truly decided to kill, and the swords realize, forcing herself to agree, despite not wanting to teach this technique. And they think that friendship is important to him. The protagonist thinks it might not be friendship, but asks her to continue talking. He tells her she was right, and about the qigong he was using Kahanato, she warns him that he could die doing it. She says it's better if he doesn't do it, unless he wants to die from using all his original energy. However, he asks what he should do, since he doesn't have an energy core, so that's the only way. He asks how she knew he knew where the herb, and she says it's first his whereabouts. All the members of the 6 Valleys of Blood search for 6 hours a day, and she encountered the Supreme Being several times during the search, but she didn't see him once. Second, that's what made her certain, and she felt it while chasing. He was running like someone, like a destiny, and he didn't look around once, only looking ahead. The protagonist notices she's intelligent, and that excuses wouldn't work, so she asks Wong Hui's name. When the protagonist says she looks older, she's surprised. Then him, so she doesn't need to be so casual, but the girl asks how he can say that about her, a disciple of a supreme being, saying she's not that old, and then he says the herb is down there, and the girl takes advantage of them being there to confirm if he hasn't told anyone about what happened earlier, and he says he was thinking about whether he should tell anyone since he didn't receive his plate coin, and she starts saying he's mean, but the protagonist says he got some better in return, so he's going to erase that memory, and she asks if he was serious, and he says he promised, but complains if she wasn't just stalking him to ask that question, and she says it's not just a question, and this is important to her, and the protagonist then goes to the flower and picks it, and the girl is surprised that it's the herb, saying it was a relief that it was there, telling them both to take it and leave, but the protagonist thinks she's happy as expected, but his lady tells the protagonist to jump forward. He doesn't understand, but then a cultist arrives, and he notices that he didn't sense anyone's presence, and she didn't notice either, despite being better, and these people are certainly strong, and one of them says that they made the right choice in following, because he took the herb, ordering another to take them both down. Rayon questions who they are, but they are hit, and the protagonist asks how long they've been followed. Then he mentions the disciples of the 4 Supreme Being, asking permission, and then he simply knocks out a protagonist. Rayon tries to do something while the protagonist is down, but he falls face down, and she questions when they got this far, because she won't be able to catch up at this, and so she simply looks at the protagonist and says she'll be right back, telling them to stop right. The protagonist notices that it seems she avoided being attacked because she's better than, and he thinks that's good, but she could at least have released her pressure points before. While he's lying there, he questions what this is, since they're being released, and the southern sky says that her Kinato released her pressure points, asking if he's alright. The protagonist says he is, but the Kinato seems to have many unknown benefits, while her mother is very angry with the girl, asking how she could have abandoned someone who helped her, saying that a person is more important than a herb, asking if that herb is really that important, sending the protagonist must chase after, or he'll lose the herb, but he wonders if he really needs to, as this might actually be a good thing. The herb wasn't fully grown, and the little balls inside change as they grow. Once mature, they glow green. They think there are 5 purple balls, and the surrounding area is full of unripe herb. He says they're all unripe, and the real summer recovery herb was found behind the frozen waterfall. They would have taken that one too if they'd ambushed him a little late. They can't see anything there because the light doesn't reach that spot, but Sodam says she can see some. The protagonist finally thanks her for her help, mentioning the 7 glowing green balls, saying he has 2 of, but those are the real ones. It's a sacred herb that only blooms on winter nights, and his hand gets cold even though he hasn't touched it. Then, as he's preparing to grab it, something is behind him. The protagonist thinks it must be cold, thinking it's nice in the summer, but Sodam tells the protagonist that the broken blade right there is saying some, and the protagonist asks him to wait because he's almost finished. She goes to her, asking what she's saying, but can't hear, so she tells them to run. Sodam goes to the protagonist, telling him not to say anything and just run, but realizes it's too late, and a monster appears in front of him, telling him that it's very fast, ordering him to grab his sword made of blue sky iron and try to stop that. The protagonist questions what that was, and the blue sky says he doesn't know either, and he's never seen anything like it in his life. Sodam says it seems very big, and the protagonist thinks he can't do anything because he can't see it. He grabbed the herb and just needs to get out of it, but while he tries to do that, the snake continues to chase him, running after him at an absurd speed, and the blue sky says that it's coming, and he thinks it's too late to escape. He dodges and strikes it with his blade, and the protagonist already feels insecure, unsure if this will work against the monster. However, he considers using his attack against it, employing the Shining Star Sword technique, the second technique, the Hidden Frog Strike. He notices it's tough, but there are definitely weaker points, making him think it's not impossible to win against it. The creature crawls towards the protagonist, and Sodam asks if he's scared, as he's becoming much more cautious. Then the blue sky tells him to consider this his chance, urging the protagonist not to let it escape. The protagonist charges at the creature, cutting it once more, and declares he will kill it no matter what. Using the strongest power he possesses now, the Shining Star Sword technique, his first technique, he throws the Tiger Strength Sword. He thinks he succeeded, and the attack worked, but even finding it incredible and seeing the sword fall, the protagonist feels something, and Sodam asks what it is. The protagonist then falls hard to the ground, and she asks what happened, if he's okay, and the protagonist says it's hot, and ends up realizing that the poison is spreading, and he can feel the energy, that the venom is rising up his ankle, and his chin is resisting it, but the pain isn't lessened, and the venom is too strong. It feels like his body is on fire, and the pain is setting his body ablaze. Even his throat is hot. He can't think clearly because of the heat, but he thinks of a way to calm the heat, and it's the summer recovery herb. This should help, since it's a sacred herb cooling it. So when he swallows it, he imagines the coolness descending through his throat, and it's unbelievable cold. He's surprised again, as the heat and cold are colliding in the middle of his body. Then Sodam speaks to Enro, telling him to combine the two and control the energy within him, taunting him, asking if he returned to die like this, telling him to combine it. He thinks Sodam is right, because he gained a second chance by dying, and if he couldn't bear pain like this, then he isn't, not at all better than in his past life, and he thinks he has managed to stabilize his mind, thanking Sodam, because he will live no matter what. And after he manages to do this, the protagonist feels something, because the Big Dipper is shining in his hand again, and a voice speaks to the protagonist, saying that since he is able to hear the sword, let Merak be open, and the protagonist notices this voice, saying that he thinks he heard it before, along with the blue flower, but he begins to lose focus, and thus, the energy takes over, and he notices that the two energies are colliding and fighting each other. They are fighting each other to harm him, but the southern sky commands him not to stop circulating his energy. He must continue circulating Quinary, and the protagonist realizes that this is the iron sword of the southern sky, and it says that he must not be swept away by the two energies, commanding him not to try to suppress them, and that he must use the energy flow of the core to guide them. And the protagonist is surprised by this, thinking he will try, and so he tells him to think of it as a calm lake, and even when lightning and thunder strike, it is a lake that remains quiet, calm, and no matter how violently the two sides of the strong currents that have lost their flows whip around, if they find their way through the lake, they will become small rip and then weaken, slowly and very carefully, and the protagonist realizes that they are calming down, and the two fierce energies are finally calming down in his chest, and it is as if they were enjoying a very strong liquor, and his insides are now comfortable, and Sodam asks if he is awake, asking about the poisonous energy, if it has weakened, and he says yes, because thanks to the help of the southern sky, he has reached a balance. However, she is surprised, asking if he's sure the poisonous energy has calmed down, and he questions what she's talking, and she says that the southern sky is right there, far from him, and he says that it couldn't have been him, asking if he's sure he heard his voice, and the protagonist says that he clearly heard it, and thinking about, after he heard the voice inside the blue flower, he heard the voice of the southern sky. However, she is surprised, because he also said something similar before, asking if this is the power of the secret record of the immortal sword. The protagonist notices that this ability is definitely getting stronger each time the color of the marks changes, and she thinks this is fascinating and wonders how far he is able to hear their voices, and the southern sky thinks this is an unbelievable ability, and the protagonist says that if he has the chance to escape the Valley of Six Bloods, he will definitely need to find the secret record of the immortal sword. However, he questions what this disgusting looking monster, wondering if the guy who came to get the immortal snow herb in his past life also encountered this monster, and so, the southern sky says that by its appearance, he doubts it is a mystical, and the protagonist says that if it is a mystical creature, he would vomit his inner elixir, but he ends up noticing that everything is collapsing and runs away. Then she asks if he is alright, asking why he jumped off the cliff, and the protagonist says that he didn't do it on purpose, he just exerted a little force, and he jumped, but his body flew far away, and then the southern sky spoke to Hanru, instructing him to use the Kinato cultivation technique and examine the inside of body. The protagonist then then tries to do this and is surprised, as the grain has grown large, almost double the original amount. If he were to put a value on, his Kinato has become an essence worth 30 years. The Southern Sky thinks this is correct, as Kinato is directly connected to his original energy. One could say it's his life. Although it's difficult to expand his Kinato through elixir, it becomes more stimulated the more extreme situations he faces. The powerful yang energy of the monster's poison and the relentlessly cold energy of the herb likely stimulated the boy's Kinato growth. The protagonist thinks that the more he discovers about Kinato, the more he realizes it's completely different from internal energy. The sword says that whatever it is, he was able to obtain it. The opportunity arises to gain enough internal energy, easily subdue the top-tier martial arts master. But then Sodam asks if he's gotten stronger after enduring pain that felt like death, saying she just had a great idea, asking if he doesn't have any more of the immortal Neva herb, saying that now that he knows the method to control poison and cold energy, he asks how about they do it again, because if he succeeds again, his Kinato will double once more. But the two look at her as if she were crazy, and she says that with 60 years of Kinato, he'll become a damn good martial arts master. And while she continues spouting this nonsense, the protagonist leaves her behind, while those two thieves finally get close to where they needed to go. But paying attention to the girl, they begin to notice that she is slowing down, and they no longer see her, and they think her stamina is low because she is fat, and they say they were lucky because Von Rue gave them the good stuff, and they were totally lucky to decide to follow him. But they still have questions, wondering how someone with a destroyed energy core used the Kegon. However, the other says that they only need to worry about getting the herb and getting out of the Valley of Six Bloods. However, while they run, they are hit by the girl, and they shout so. Hyung orders him to return the immortal mist herb now, as it's hit. He says that despite her size, she still has good martial arts and Kegong skill, since she's a disciple of the blood, but things will be different in a one-on-one fight. However, he's completely stunned, not understanding what's happening, and the blood witch arrives, taking the herb for herself. She asks if they know who they just ambushed, and probably they were only thinking about the pride. But she asks why the girl left without saying it. Then, she apologizes to her master, and she says she's glad he's alright. But that thing she's holding in her hands catches her attention, and the girl says it's the immortal mist herb they stole. She's surprised that the girl found, saying that now that she's safely recovered the herb, they'll go back. But the girl says no, asking her to go back first, because she needs to return to where she came from. The blood witch doesn't understand any. Meanwhile, the protagonist emerges from the ravine, believing he can now climb such heights without losing his breath. Then the Southern Sky reveals that what is innate is the power of life, not just his internal energy, but all his physical ability comes strong. However, as he exits and looks ahead, he's surprised to see Rayon approaching from afar. Since the swords can't see her, they assume his vision and hearing have also advanced to the next level. The protagonist notices she returned after chasing those men, which is incredible because she must consume significantly more stamina than the others when running. It seems she possesses a very strong mental power, and the Southern Sky suggests this is a good sign, as if he accumulates more than what is innate, he will be able to detect others even if they try to hide. The protagonist begins to enjoy becoming stronger as he experiences these changes in his body. He speaks to Rayon, expressing his happiness that she is safe, and she asks if he is alright, requesting. The protagonist apologized, explaining that he should have released his pressure points before pursuing them, but he says it's alright after all the situation was urgent. Unfortunately, his pressure points released on their own, and they think they didn't block them properly. The girl asks what happened to his foot, suggesting it's their fault and asking if it's badly hurt. The protagonist tells her it's fine, and they only scratched it a little. He then mentions something more important, asking if she managed to retrieve the immortal snow orb. She says she captured them thanks to her master's help, but she wanted to apologize to him first, just in case something unexpected happens again, that he asked his mistress first take the immortal snow herb back to the divine healer, and the protagonist realizes that everything went wrong. She asks him not to misunderstand, saying that she will still give him the tablet. However, he asks if her mistress will give up the tablet just because her disciple told her to, asking how she expects him to believe. She asks him not to worry, as she will certainly give it up, but she will deliver it to the elder Rai. She thinks Rai will ask for something in return for the tablet, and the protagonist is surprised that it's so easy, noticing that this changes things a bit. The witch is actually talking to the elder, saying that, as she said, if he helps her with her request, she will hand over the plaque of the divine healer, that he approaches her, but says he's sure he already said he doesn't want to be involved in this matter, asking how she dares to negotiate plaque. She asks if he doesn't know, saying he only has two options regardless of his desire, and she asks him to interfere with, even questions she's considering the other option. Meanwhile, the red-haired girl is far away, distancing herself from the cult, and she asks Asha he doesn't know that eventually he'll have to make this decision. He tells Heller to go to hell, asking if she thinks he'll do what he wants just because he wants to cure Dantian of a mere disciple. She says he's certainly saying this as if he doesn't care, and he says he just needs to give up that brat. She says that can't be avoided, and in that case, she doesn't think she'll be able to give up the plaque for him, but inside she wonders, briefing her Siri. The protagonist returns to Asya, and he says the boy is very late, saying that he will never again be able to heal his Dante. Mangasam tells Blood 6 Star that this is a pity, as she will need to get another immortal snow herb. The girl asks what he means, and he explains that this herb is not fully grown and has no healing prop. A fully grown immortal snow herb would have 7 green balls inside a petal, but this herb only has 5 balls and is a younger. Ashiao starts laughing, saying that it seems they will have to search for the herb again. The protagonist apologizes for interrupting them, saying there's no need to do so because he brought back the fully grown immortal snow herb, taking it from his clothes. Mangasam says it's a great coincidence, and to think that 2 people would find the herbs almost at the same time, and this one has 7 balls on its petal and is undoubtedly a fully grown herb. Ashiao bursts out laughing, saying that this was truly expected of his disciple. But then Areo asks what just happened and why he didn't tell him, asking if he deceived. But the protagonist says that she went back on her word about finding the herb together first, and he thinks that's what she meant, but he doesn't know how to use the whispering technique by frequency. Then he asks the elder if he can ask a question, asking if the witch would give up the tablet, but he laughs at that, saying that she told him not to even dream of touching and threatened that he would never have it if he didn't do what she commanded. He asks what nonsense he's talking about, and then the witch takes the guy, asking the elder when threatened. Then he asks if she's saying what she would have given, and she's at a crossroad. And then looking back, she sees her disciple with a closed expression, and so the protagonist thinks he's right, noting that the matter is resolved, and also thinks that she doesn't seem very happy, but there's nothing to be done. A bet is a bet. Some time ago, before Rayon and Henri return to the Valley of Six Blood, she questions whether the boy can't trust his master, and says that she already taught him her Qigong technique, and even so he still couldn't trust her. The protagonist says that he does trust her, but he's not sure that the witch will give up the plaque. Man, she keeps thinking of, because if her master doesn't keep his promise, she'll have no choice but to follow his word. She says her master will keep her promise, and the protagonist asks if he's sure. She says of course, asking how a disciple could doubt their own master, but she certainly knows it's like. So he tries to make a bet with, and she's surprised proposing a wager. He says it's simple. She can continue trusting her master, and he'll trust his own judgment. Anyway, since her master took the herb, it's too late for either of them to say they found. She says she knows, and she's truly sorry about it, since he missed the opportunity to obtain the plaque. He questions whether there shouldn't be something to compensate. She says he really looks like a cheat now, asking what he wants to bet on. He confirms that she said she knows this important person, and she says yes, confirming that's it. Even so, they are known, but the protagonist says it's great, saying that if he loses, he will not only persuade the elder to give up, but he will also give up the divine healer's plaque that her mistress going to receive, and she is surprised that he would give up the plaque, asking what he wants if he wins. And he says that the plaque of someone of such a high rank, who is not only important in the Valley of Six Blood, but also important enough to be served by the 6th blood star, is what he would like. He would like that person's plaque. And returning to the present with the witch, she cuts off 2 of his fingers, and the protagonist can't believe she did that. So she apologizes to the elder, asking forgiveness for asking in such a disrespectful way, saying that although cutting off an arm is not enough to compensate for his stress, she hopes he will be generous, and takes into consideration that she is currently on a mission to escort an important person. He thinks she is as cunning as always, and he will accept her apologies because of his loyalty is appreciated, and she thanks him once more. The doctor thinks this is quite unpleasant behavior they're displaying right in front of a healer, but the elder says there's something more important, stating that he needs to fulfill his promise. He agrees, but the plaque should be given to his disciple, not him. He thinks it doesn't matter, as they'll be asking for the same thing anyway. He says he'll keep his promise, but since he has a prior appointment, he'll first attend to that person. He tells the protagonist to return at noon the next day, and since he has some time to spare, he'll check on his condition. At noon the following day in the Valley of the Seikanti, the protagonist goes there, using Aishung's Qigong technique, but he thinks she's actually more effective when used on Rocky Mountain. So Soden talks to the protagonist, who has thought of something, asking if he doesn't find it strange, as it seemed like everyone was suspicious of how Rayong reacted, and it was the same thing when the divine healer suddenly changed words, and the blood witch also changed her attitude or look at Rayong, and she was just observing like a spectator when her mistress ripped off her own finger, and it's as if she were in a higher position than the blood wit, and the protagonist Onista says that she probably does have a higher position, and if he's right, she's not just a disciple of the blood. So Soden asks if she's his daughter, but she says no, saying that she's the granddaughter of the leader of the blood cult, and they are both surprised by this, saying that nobody would suspect such thing, because who would imagine that she would be the granddaughter of a leader of a scary and powerful place like this cult. And the South Sky finally solves the riddle, thinking that it must be difficult to gain weight just to hide her identity, and the protagonist notices that thinking about this, she said she had to to lose weight, and he then begins to suppose that her illness is what makes her gain weight. But if she is the only granddaughter of the leader of the blood sect, then it is almost certain that she will become the next leader of the sect, and it is a fatal disease for both women and martial artists. However, Soden, when they arrive there, questions who that woman standing behind the curtain is, and the protagonist thinks that she is probably a substitute, and since there are tons of people after the granddaughter of the leader of the blood sect, she is there to act as a mannequin. But the South Sky says that there is something that makes her suspicious, so the protagonist asks what it could be, and he says that this is the territory of the blood sect, and he wants to appear powerless. But he questions if she has such a need to hide her identity that she has a substitute. But the protagonist questions if he's misunderstanding something, wondering why he thinks the leader of the blood sect would only have one granddaughter, and he starts to think about the possibility of having a bunch of grandchildren, and if they all want to become the leader of the blood sect, it would cause a huge problem. But then he sees several people around wondering who they are, because he didn't even know these people exist in the Valley of Six. Even when the protagonist sets foot there, he starts to feel unwell, hearing several voices, and then he realizes it's the side effect the ability recently obtained. So the Southern Sky tells him not to pay attention to these noises, saying that the boy should do as he always does, because he doesn't pay attention to everything the people around him are saying. But he says that these voices are very loud, and they are in his head, so how is he going to ignore them? This only raises one question: how about he just ignore what is natural? And he says that, in fact, the voices became softer after he circled what is natural in his head, and then a girl asks who he is, and how he got there, and he says he thinks it's too late to avoid because of those roses on the sword, and he says he's an apprentice, but the girl says he's too slow, throwing him away, saying he's still slow for an apprentice. However, she realizes he's alive, and stopped her attack with just his hand. However, the protagonist is surprised, wondering why she, saying he's slow, without even giving him a chance to answer, and this woman, she launched an incredibly strong attack, and he actually gained some confidence in his abilities after he wanted to reach 30, but still, that single blow made him feel a pain that felt like his entire inside was being twisted, and then that woman draws her sword, thinking the boy is interested. While the two are face to face, Rayon appeared, ordering them to stop immediately, saying that he's not a simple apprentice, he's a disciple of the elder Axiom, and she's surprised, asking if he accepted a disciple, because he should have said so from the beginning, and she almost killed him for nothing, and the protagonist thinks she's a little strange, because from the beginning, she was trying to kill him with that single blow, and in that she says that for sure, her master created a great the disciple, and it's the first time she's seen someone close to her age manage block her attack, and she asks if her master has been doing well, and he notices that she's very proud of these skills, but putting that aside, she speaks of her master as if he were in a higher position, and she says that it's been years since anyone saw him, just like second blood star, and the protagonist thinks that to be able to speak of the supreme blood star as if they were nothing, she strangely resembles Rayon, supposing that they are similar, and Rayon asks if the girl didn't say she's leaving, asking her to please leave quick, as she won't be able to send her back. But then the redhead gets very angry at the girl, because people might think she owns the Valley of Six Bloods with that tone of voice, saying that she will leave when she wants, telling Rayon to stop rushing because it's starting to get annoying, ready to draw her sword. Then the two stand face to face, emanating their guide, and the protagonist thinks that if he had known this was going to happen, he would have come later. But then the doctor arrives and recognizes that voice, and he sees that she arrived at the right time. Then the redhead gets angry because that ruined all her fun, and she's leaving. She tells the protagonist to send his regards to his master, and also says that they will have a fight the next time they meet. Sodom asks if he will do what she's asking, while the Southern Sky says that his former master told him to be careful with that kind woman. The protagonist can only think that she really gives him the creeps, because the sword belongs to that woman, and he wonders what she did to cause the sword so much pain, since she's asking someone to kill her. Then the protagonist talks to Rayon, asking if she's alright, mentioning the redhead, but the girl cuts him off, saying that the divine healer is looking for him. He thinks she definitely heard what he was saying, but intentionally cut him off, basically telling him not to ask him nothing, and he thinks he has a good guess, but that's none of his business. He doesn't interfere in everything, just because he's Ixeo's disciple. And then, when he's inside the place, the doctor says that it's bizarre, because he has much more cold energy accumulate in his body than most, asking how he ended up eating an immortal snow herb, and the protagonist is surprised. And so, Manshansin says that he's a healer. He doesn't talk about his patients to anyone, so he can rest assured and tell detail. And so, the Southern Sky tells him not to worry, because that guy is trustworthy, since numerous martial masters given him their plates, and Sodam says yes, says that maybe he will help him heal. The protagonist tells him that he was searching for the immortal snow herb fully grown, and ended up going after a waterfall, and in that place, he saw a monster with 4 purple eyes, and a face resembling a human. The doctor is surprised that he managed to find the vipe with a human face and purple eye, saying that this is truly a rare experience, because that strange-looking snake hides in the dark and devours humans when it can, and is more like a demon than a monster. and he tells the boy that she hates anything shiny, so it would be almost impossible to see her if he were carrying a torch, saying he says he was very unlucky, but that's why he ate that herb. However, there's something he doesn't understand. The immortal snow herb doesn't have purifying ability, and he sees not only cold energy in all the boy's vessel, but also hot yang energy that is free of poison. The protagonist thinks the poison has probably been removed, and he wonders if it's because of his kinato, blood clot. And it seems that kinato has the ability to dissipate toxins, which was also the case for the blood parasite. He also asks the doctor if it's okay for him to carry yang energy, cold energy, in his body, questioning whether they will cause any problem. The doctor says that of course it would cause problem, but only if one of the energies remained in his body. The cold and yang energies are in balance, melting within his vessel. This is as good as eating elixir and accumulating energy afterward, and the protagonist doesn't believe it. He questions if this means he can quickly accumulate internal energy when, if his energy core is repaired. The doctor explains that it will depend on how hard it works to accumulate it. However, if he is able to properly absorb the melted energy from both energy within his vessels in a balanced way, he will be able to increase his internal energy faster than others. He then gives the protagonist the plate he promised, but the protagonist questions what he's doing, as there's no need for him to give the plate since he's going to treat his dante. The protagonist thinks for a moment and asks the doc if he's incapable of treating his dante. Mansion replies, asking what he has to heal when he's perfectly fine. The protagonist can't believe it, and the doctor says he doesn't know what it seemed, explaining that's why he asked treat it. He says that's where the dante on it and he should know about, but if he moves that area, he'll feel those strange, small things like insect, which are fragments from when his dantian was damaged. But within that fire that was extinct, it has these really small essences, and they are like sparks that have come back to life, and it's really a very rare occurrence for a dantian to recover on its own. And at that point the protagonist asks if he's saying that his dantian healed itself completely on its own, and he says that's the only guess he has right now, because this is an extremely rare occurrence, and it's really hard to see something like that, since most people give up once their dantian is destroyed. And since he won't treat him, he gives the plaque to the boy, who starts to thank him, but he says that there's no need to thank since he didn't do anything. And when the protagonist leaves, that just giving the plaque happens, because this is basically the same as receiving 2 plaques from the divine healer. And the protagonist thinks that's true, because even if he took 2 of them, he would have used 1 to heal his dante. But she questions how his dantian recovered so quick, and the protagonist thinks he has a hunch about, asking if she remembers how the wound on his leg healed after he killed Vibra and circulated the energy, and his body's recovery rate increased so much that it could regenerate new flesh in a very short period of time. And his Dan even starts to think that he should thank Vibra, and the protagonist says that he is very grateful. However, she notices that the sky in the south beta protagonist, silent for a moment, says that Dantian's recovery is a good thing, but something is worrying. His former master only mastered the Kaneto cultivation technique after destroying his own Dante, and the protagonist notices that this was indeed the technique he read about. The southern sky confirms this, wondering if the middle and lower energy core can coexist. The protagonist thinks what he's saying makes sense. The southern sky suggests paying closer attention, because if he tries to control everything at once, he might lose even what he already. Returning to Tion, he says this is becoming problematic, as there are certainly stranger occurrences happening. The protagonist thinks about knowing not just one, but both women. The protagonist ponders this, and asks Tion what he means by knowing both. Tion says that the woman is right, and thinks he'll have to make a decision, ignoring the protagonist and talking to himself. The protagonist supposes he must be wondering which one to choose. Of the two, he must support, and he says that there was a time when the cult leader was so strong that he was known as the pinnacle of unorthodox sects, and not just the blood sect, and he rushed into everything without hesitation with a fierce storm. And with him he thought that uniting all of who would not just be a dream, but no matter how strong he was, defeat was inevitable when many people combined their power. And after going through all that, felt that everything meaningless, and the others wanted him to rebuild or destroy the other, to try to revive his sect, and they tried to increase their forces in every way possible, but all of that was meaningless. And that is why after he got rid of all responsibility, he traveled around doing useless things, and thought that he should just use the time he had to complete the things he couldn't before. And the protagonist thinks that he is probably talking about the revenge duel that the southern sky meant before, and thought that he was just a strange and crazy old man. However, he thinks that the action had its own circumstances, and he tells the protagonist that even trying to live that way, now he's seeing the seeds he left behind struggling to grow from a sprout to a flower. Then he asks the protagonist what he would do in a time like that, and the protagonist, judging by his look, thinks he's already decided, and he's testing him with this question. The protagonist says that if he's going to stand still and watch a flower bloom, then it would be right to leave it as he said, but if that's not the case, He asks if he shouldn't prepare fertilizer to help the flower bloom, thinking that it would probably be much better to say what he really thinks, and based on his previous life, Axion didn't choose either side, so he doubts that his answer will influence him anyway. But then, unlike what the protagonist is thinking, Axion says that they will need more strength, and the protagonist is surprised. He says that it's as he said, and no matter which flower he chooses, he will need fertilizer to use it, and they will have a lot of work from now on, saying that they have about 6 months left, and he will need to become a captain by then. The protagonist realizes that he wants to increase his strength, and this is a simple state, but it means a lot because he is different from the other 4 Supremes and 7 Stars. He is eccentric and solitary, and it means that he will increase his personal strength, and it also means that the story of Axion as he knows it will change, and a future that is totally different from his previous life being formed. Hey kid, are you kidding me? You thought you were going to, so if you got there, you were going to change everything. Kill a guy who didn't die, interact with a bunch of, become a disciple of the guy who only had 2 disciples and nothing would change. You're kidding, right? Go watch some The Butterfly Effect and you'll understand what I'm talking about. And simply put, manhwa is very good so far. My friends, all of you who recommended this, thank you very much. I have to formally thank you all because you're awesome. And remember, if you want more videos of this manhwa, don't forget to leave a like because I'll definitely bring you more. And I'll see you in the next video. I went.